Medieval prisoners actually paid rent to live in their cells, and the wealthy ones threw dinner parties behind bars. If you think you know what prison was like 800 years ago, you're probably completely wrong. What I discovered will shatter everything you believed about medieval justice. You might think people went to medieval prison for murder or robbery, but the reality was way stranger. Debt could land you behind bars faster than stabbing someone. Seriously, owe money to the wrong merchant, and you'd find yourself chained to a wall, hoping your family could scrape together enough coins to buy your freedom. Then there's heresy. Question the church's teachings. Prison. Refuse to pay your religious taxes. Prison. Even something as simple as working on a Sunday could get you locked up. The church didn't mess around when it came to rule breaking, and their rules covered everything from what you believed to when you could bake bread. Petty theft was obviously a one-way ticket to jail, but we're talking about stealing things worth practically nothing. A loaf of bread, a handful of grain, maybe some fabric scraps. The punishment rarely matched the crime. But here's where it gets interesting. Political prisoners made up a huge chunk of the prison population. These weren't hardened criminals. They were people who backed the wrong nobleman, criticized the king a little too loudly, or got caught up in some local power struggle they probably didn't even understand. Speaking of power struggles, breaking church rules was practically a guaranteed prison sentence. The medieval church had authority over way more than just Sunday service. They controlled marriage laws, business practices, even what you could eat on certain days. Eat meat on Friday, that's jail time. Try to get divorced without church approval, definitely prison. Challenge a priest's decision about anything, you'd better start saying your goodbyes. What made all this worse was how inconsistent the laws were from place to place. Something perfectly legal in one town could get you executed in the next village over. Travel was basically a legal minefield. Merchants had to memorize dozens of different rule sets just to avoid accidentally breaking laws they'd never heard of. Forest laws were particularly brutal. Cutting down the wrong tree could cost you a hand, or worse. Minor infractions that we'd laugh at today were serious business back then. Gossiping about your neighbors, being too loud at night, or even dressing above your social station could land you in prison. The concept of proportional punishment didn't really exist. Whether you stole a horse or insulted someone's cow, you might end up in the same cell facing similar treatment. Political prisoners were everywhere because medieval politics were incredibly messy. Kings constantly fought with nobles, nobles fought with each other, and everyone fought with the church. Pick the wrong side in any of these conflicts and you'd find yourself labeled a traitor. Even staying neutral could be seen as suspicious. Loyalty was everything, but figuring out who deserved your loyalty was nearly impossible when alliances changed faster than the weather. Let's not forget that many prisoners weren't even convicted of anything. The legal system moved slower than a three-legged horse, so people sat in jail for months or years waiting for trials that might never come. Being accused was often enough. Your neighbor claims you practiced witchcraft. Prison. Someone says you cheated them in business. Prison. Evidence was optional. The weirdest part is how religious crimes were treated more seriously than violent ones. Beat someone unconscious and you might pay a fine. Question whether saints could really perform miracles and you'd face months of imprisonment, torture, or worse. The church's priorities were crystal clear. Challenge their authority and you'd pay dearly. Regional differences made everything more confusing. What counted as a crime in London might be perfectly acceptable in York. Local lords created their own laws based on personal preferences, political needs, or just random whims. Some regions were incredibly strict about trade regulations while others barely cared. Others obsessed over moral crimes while ignoring theft and violence. Forest laws deserve special mention because they were absolutely insane. Royal forests covered huge portions of medieval Europe, and the rules governing them were ridiculously harsh. Not just poaching, even picking up fallen branches could get you imprisoned. These weren't just about protecting animals either. Everything from the trees to the grass to the rocks belonged to the king, and touching any of it without permission was considered theft. But here's what really mattered. Enforcement was random and often depended on who you knew, how much money you had, and whether the local authorities liked you. The same crime might result in a small fine for a wealthy merchant, and years of imprisonment for a poor farmer. Justice wasn't blind, it was actively looking the other way, if you had enough coins to make it worthwhile. The entire system was designed to maintain control, rather than deliver actual justice. Fear kept people in line more than any sense of right and wrong. When almost anything could be considered a crime, everyone was potentially a criminal. Now, you might be wondering who actually ended up in these prisons. because the answer will surprise you more than the crimes themselves. So you've learned why people ended up in medieval prisons, but who exactly were these unlucky souls? The answer might surprise you. Medieval jails weren't just filled with hardened criminals lurking in the shadows. They housed a bizarre mix of society that would make today's prisons look organized by comparison. Rich merchants sat next to starving beggars. Noble ladies found themselves sharing space with common thieves. Well, not exactly sharing the same room. We'll get to that distinction later. But the point stands, prison wasn't reserved for one particular class of people. Money didn't automatically keep you out, though it certainly changed your experience once inside. Let's talk about the clergy first. These religious folks had a special trick up their sleeves called benefit of clergy. Basically, if you could prove you were connected to the church, even loosely, you might avoid the worst punishments. Some clever criminals actually learned to read Latin just to fake being clergy members when arrested. Makes sense, right? But when church officials did end up behind bars, they often got sent to special religious prisons run by church authorities, rather than secular ones. Then there's the fascinating case of nobles. These high-ranking folks rarely saw the inside of a dungeon cell. Instead, they got what we'd call house arrest today, except their house might be a comfortable castle chamber. Political prisoners, those who crossed kings or powerful lords, often fell into this category. They lived under guard but with servants, decent food, and sometimes even visitors for entertainment. Women prisoners present another interesting story entirely. Medieval society had strict ideas about gender, and prisons reflected this. Female inmates were typically housed in separate sections, though the conditions varied wildly based on their social status and the reason for their imprisonment. A noble woman accused of treason lived very differently than a peasant woman caught stealing bread. But here's where it gets really weird. Many people in medieval prisons hadn't actually been convicted of anything yet. The legal system moved slowly, and trials could take months or even years to happen. So jails became holding pens for the accused, mixing people who might be innocent with those definitely guilty. Some prisoners spent more time waiting for trial than they would have served if convicted. Debtors made up a huge portion of prison populations. Owing money wasn't just a civil matter, it could land you in chains until you paid up or someone bailed you out. Rich merchants who made bad investments found themselves alongside poor farmers who couldn't pay taxes. The irony, being in prison made it nearly impossible to earn money to pay off debts, creating a vicious cycle that trapped many for years. Political prisoners were another common sight. These weren't necessarily criminals in the traditional sense, but people who had angered those in power, speaking against a lord, supporting the wrong side in a conflict, or even spreading unfavorable gossip could result in imprisonment. Medieval politics were personal, and jails often became tools for settling scores. Religious dissidents also filled medieval cells. The church held enormous power, and challenging religious doctrine could be as dangerous as challenging political authority. Heretics, as they were called, might face imprisonment before trials that could end in execution. But determining what counted as heresy often depended on local politics and personal vendettas rather than consistent theological principles. The weird part is how accusations worked back then. Medieval justice relied heavily on witness testimony and social standing. If you were already unpopular in your community, false accusations could stick more easily. Conversely, respected community members might avoid jail even when clearly guilty of crimes. Children occasionally appeared in medieval prisons too, though usually not for long sentences. The concept of juvenile justice barely existed, but very young offenders might be released to their families or local religious institutions for supervision. Age wasn't always a protection though. Older children could face adult punishments for serious crimes. Foreigners and travelers faced particular vulnerability. Without local connections or knowledge of regional laws, outsiders could easily find themselves imprisoned on charges they didn't understand. Language barriers made defending themselves nearly impossible, and lack of local support meant longer stays behind bars. Even more surprising were the temporary prisoners, people jailed during investigations, or while authorities figured out what to do with them. Someone might spend weeks in prison, while officials decided whether their case belonged in church courts, royal courts, or local tribunals. The bureaucracy of medieval justice moved glacially, leaving many in legal limbo. The social mixing in medieval prisons created its own unique dynamics. Nobles might find themselves learning survival skills from common criminals, while educated clergy could become informal legal advisors for illiterate cellmates. These relationships often continued after release, creating unexpected social connections across class lines. But understanding who went to prison is just the beginning of this story. Knowing the types of people behind bars helps explain what happened next, because your social status, wealth, and connections determined everything about your prison experience, starting from the very moment you arrived at those imposing gates. Walking through those heavy wooden doors meant your old life was officially over, well, at least temporarily. The entrance to a medieval prison wasn't some dramatic descent into a bottomless pit like Hollywood loves to show us. Most jails sat right inside castle walls, tucked into city gates, or crammed underneath town towers where everyone could see them. These weren't hidden dungeons buried miles underground. They were part of everyday life, visible reminders of what happened when you crossed the wrong people or couldn't pay your debts. Castle prisons made perfect sense when you think about it. The Lord already had thick walls, armed guards, and a reputation for being tough. Why build something new when you could just convert a few rooms? Many castles had small chambers specifically designed to hold troublemakers, complete with iron rings bolted into stone walls and heavy doors that could withstand a battering ram. City gate prisons were equally practical. Every major town had massive gates to keep enemies out. So why not use the same structure to keep criminals in? Guards were already stationed there around the clock, and the thick stone construction meant nobody was tunneling their way to freedom. Plus, every person entering or leaving the city got a nice view of where rule breakers ended up. But here's where things get interesting. Some regions maintained forest prisons for people who broke hunting laws or chopped down the wrong trees. These remote jails sat deep in royal forests, far from help or sympathy. Breaking into the king's woods to hunt deer or gather firewood might seem harmless, but forest laws carried brutal penalties. Getting dragged to a woodland prison meant you'd violated some of the strictest rules in medieval society. The moment you crossed that threshold, guards got to work. No gentle processing here. They searched you thoroughly, looking for weapons, money, or anything valuable they could confiscate. Your possessions got recorded in whatever record-keeping system the jail used, though many smaller prisons kept sloppy records or none at all. The whole intake process moved surprisingly fast. No lengthy paperwork, no fingerprinting, no phone calls to lawyers. Guards asked your name, wrote down your crime, and assigned you to whatever space they had available. Rich prisoners got better treatment from minute one, while poor inmates found themselves shoved into whatever corner remained empty. Some jails required new arrivals to pay an entrance fee immediately. Yes, you read that right. Getting arrested cost money up front, like some twisted membership club nobody wanted to join. Guards called this garnish money, and refusing to pay meant worse conditions, smaller food portions, or heavier chains around your ankles. Jailers took this fee collection seriously because they often earned more from prisoner payments than from their official wages. A steady stream of new inmates meant steady income, creating some pretty warped incentives for keeping people locked up longer than necessary. The search process revealed just how much guards controlled every aspect of prison life. They decided what you could keep, what got confiscated, and what disappeared entirely. Valuable items rarely made it back to their original owners, even after release. Consider it an unofficial tax on getting arrested. Most prisoners entered through the same door, regardless of their social status, but that equality ended quickly. Guards sized up new arrivals within minutes, determining who had money, connections, or useful skills. This initial assessment shaped everything that followed. Family members sometimes gathered outside during intake, trying to pass messages or slip extra coins to guards. Smart relatives brought food, blankets, or clothing, knowing the prison provided almost nothing for free. Others showed up with bribes, hoping to secure better treatment for their arrested loved ones. The actual physical entrance varied dramatically between locations. Some prisons sat at ground level with normal doorways, while others required climbing down steep stone steps into basement chambers. A few jails featured multiple entrances, with separate doors for different types of prisoners or social classes. Tower prisons presented their own unique challenges. Prisoners climbed narrow spiral staircases to reach cells positioned high above the ground, making escape nearly impossible, but also complicating daily activities like food delivery or waste removal. These vertical jails saved space, but created logistical nightmares. Recording names and crimes helped guards track who owed money, who posed dangerous threats, and who might have powerful friends on the outside. Accurate records protected guards from accusations of losing prisoners or stealing their belongings, though corruption remained widespread throughout the system. The entrance ritual marked a psychological turning point, as much as a physical one. Crossing that threshold meant accepting a new reality where other people controlled when you ate, slept, or saw daylight again. Once that heavy door slammed shut behind you, the real education began. And trust me, your first look around those stone chambers would teach you lessons no school ever covered. Walking through those heavy prison doors meant leaving behind any fantasy about comfortable accommodations. The reality hit prisoners like a slap of cold, damp air mixed with smells that would make a butcher's shop seem pleasant by comparison. Most cells weren't the dramatic stone chambers you see in movies. They were practical spaces carved from whatever materials the builders had handy. Stone walls dominated, but not because they looked intimidating. Stone was cheap, available, and nearly impossible to break through with bare hands. These walls sweated moisture constantly, creating an environment that felt colder than standing outside in winter rain. The dampness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was everywhere. Water seeped through poorly constructed mortar, dripped from ceiling cracks and pooled in corners where prisoners would later try to sleep. Your clothes never fully dried once you entered. The moisture clung to fabric, skin and hair like an unwelcome companion that refused to leave. Darkness defined daily life inside these spaces. Windows were rare luxuries, and when they existed, they were barely large enough for a cat to squeeze through. Most cells relied on whatever dim light filtered down from corridors or leaked through gaps in wooden doors. Prisoners learned to navigate by touch and sound rather than sight. Reading became impossible for those lucky enough to know how, but the cold hit differently than outdoor winter weather. Outside, you could move around, find shelter, or build a fire. Inside prison walls, the stone absorbed heat during summer and radiated bone-chilling cold during winter. The temperature stayed consistently miserable, regardless of season. Prisoners described feeling cold that started in their bones and worked outward, the kind that made joints ache and muscles cramp. Then there were the roommates nobody wanted. Rats treated prison cells like luxury hotels, scurrying freely through gaps in stonework and helping themselves to any food prisoners managed to acquire. These weren't cute little mice. Medieval rats were bold, aggressive creatures that sometimes bit sleeping prisoners. They carried diseases and left droppings everywhere, adding another layer to the already overwhelming stench. Insects thrived in these conditions too. Lice, fleas and bedbugs made sleeping nearly impossible. Prisoners scratched until they bled, creating wounds that often became infected in the unsanitary conditions. Cockroaches and beetles crawled across walls and floors, particularly active during the few dark hours when even minimal light disappeared completely. The smell deserves special mention because it dominated every moment of prison life. Imagine mixing unwashed human bodies, human waste, rotting food scraps, wet stone and dead rodents. Now concentrate that mixture in a small space with no ventilation for months or years. Prisoners described the odor as rotten or musty, but those words barely captured the reality. New prisoners often vomited from the smell alone during their first few hours. Veterans learned to breathe through their mouths and became experts at ignoring what their noses detected. The stench clung to clothing and hair so thoroughly that released prisoners were often recognizable on the street weeks later. Water created constant problems beyond just dampness. Puddles formed in low spots where prisoners had to walk, sit, or lie down. The water wasn't clean. It mixed with waste, food scraps and whatever diseases the rats carried. Skin conditions flourished in these wet conditions, and simple cuts became serious infections when constantly exposed to contaminated moisture. Some prisons were worse than others, naturally. Cells built into castle foundations often flooded during heavy rains, forcing prisoners to stand for hours in ankle-deep, filthy water. Underground chambers carved from rock stayed consistently cold, but remained relatively dry. Tower cells might offer slightly better ventilation, but subjected prisoners to extreme temperature swings. The weird part is that not every prison cell matched this description exactly. Some newer facilities, or those housing wealthy prisoners, offered marginally better conditions. A few cells had proper drainage, occasional fresh straw, or even primitive heating systems, but these improvements were rare exceptions rather than standard features. Prisoners' first night often became their worst memory of the entire experience. The combination of fear, cold, stench, and strange sounds created overwhelming sensory assault. Veteran prisoners learned to offer newcomers basic survival advice. Stay away from the wettest corners, don't fight the rats over food scraps, and try to claim space near whatever light source existed. Guards rarely cleaned cells systematically. Prisoners were expected to maintain their own spaces, but without proper tools or supplies, sanitation became impossible. Old straw rotted in place, waste accumulated in corners, and dead rats decomposed wherever they fell. Makes sense why prisoners paid bribes for better accommodations when they could afford it, right? Even small improvements like dry straw, a wooden bucket, or a blanket made enormous differences in daily comfort. Well, speaking of payment, money determined almost everything about prison life, starting with the most basic necessity of all. Medieval prisons weren't free hotels. Far from it. The moment you walked through those heavy wooden doors, someone would be asking you for money. Your jailer wasn't running a charity, he was running a business, and you were about to become his customer whether you liked it or not. Most people today assume prisoners just got thrown into cells and forgotten about. Wrong. Medieval jailers expected payment for everything. Food, bedding, candles, even basic shelter came with a price tag. No money meant no dinner. Simple as that. The system worked like a twisted inn where you couldn't leave until your legal troubles got sorted out, but you still had to pay for room and board. Wealthy prisoners lived quite differently than poor ones. Rich folks could buy themselves decent meals, clean straw for bedding, and sometimes even furniture. We're talking actual beds, chairs and tables hauled right into their cells. Some wealthy inmates paid for multiple rooms, creating little apartments within the prison walls. They'd hire servants to bring them wine, fresh bread, and meat while poor prisoners gnawed on scraps. Poor prisoners faced a brutal reality. Without coins in their pockets, they relied on charity, or went hungry. Many survived on donations from local churches or kind strangers who took pity on inmates. Beggars outside prison walls often ate better than prisoners inside them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Commit a crime when you're broke, and you might literally starve while paying for your mistake. Jailers made serious profits from this arrangement. They charged what the market could bear, and prisoners had no choice but to pay up or suffer. A loaf of bread that cost 1 penny outside might cost 3 pennies inside. Water, which should have been free, came with fees attached. Jailers justified these outrageous prices by claiming they provided security and service. Really, they just had a captive customer base. The wealthy didn't just buy food, they bought comfort and privilege. Rich prisoners paid for private cells instead of sharing cramped spaces with common criminals. They purchased the right to have visitors more frequently. Some even paid to have their chains removed, or made lighter. Money bought freedom of movement within the prison, better treatment from guards, and protection from other inmates. Then there's the fascinating world of prison amenities that money could buy. Wealthy inmates purchased books, games, musical instruments, and art supplies. Some hired tutors to continue their education while imprisoned. Others paid for elaborate meals prepared by outside cooks and delivered hot to their cells. The contrast with poor prisoners was stark and intentional. Jailers developed creative ways to extract money from inmates. They charged fees for everything: admission to the prison, weekly rent for cell space, removal of leg irons, use of the prison's chapel, and even discharge fees when prisoners were finally released. Leave prison without paying your tab, and you might find yourself dragged right back inside. Poor prisoners developed their own survival strategies. They formed groups to share whatever food they could get. Some sold their clothes or personal belongings to other inmates for food money. Others offered services like letter writing, shoe repair, or entertainment in exchange for meals. The prison economy was surprisingly complex, with its own informal currency system. Charitable donations kept many poor prisoners alive, but even charity had its problems. Jailers sometimes intercepted donations meant for inmates, keeping the best items for themselves and passing along only scraps. Religious groups and wealthy families made regular donations, but there was never enough to go around. Competition for charity could get fierce among desperate prisoners. Female prisoners faced additional challenges in this pay-to-survive system. Women typically had less access to money than men, making them more dependent on charity or family support. Some women prisoners worked as seamstresses or laundresses for wealthier inmates to earn food money. Others relied on visits from husbands or fathers who brought coins and supplies. The most successful prison entrepreneurs were often the jailers themselves. They ran prison taverns where inmates could buy ale and wine. They operated prison shops selling overpriced goods. Some jailers rented out space to outside merchants who wanted to sell to the captive prison population. Business was good when you had customers who couldn't shop anywhere else. What made this system particularly cruel was its unpredictability. Prisoners never knew how long they'd be locked up, making it impossible to budget their resources. A debtor expecting release in a week might stay for months. A person awaiting trial could languish for years. Running out of money while still imprisoned meant facing starvation, disease, and death. But here's where things get really interesting. This pay-as-you-go prison system created unexpected social dynamics among inmates. Rich prisoners sometimes hired poor ones as servants, creating miniature class systems within prison walls. These relationships could be protective or exploitative, depending on the personalities involved. The social mixing that resulted would surprise anyone expecting medieval prisons to be simple dungeons filled with chained criminals. Once you'd paid your entrance fees and gotten past that initial shock of prison smells, the real sorting began. Medieval prisons weren't just random crowds of people thrown together. They had a system, and like everything else in medieval life, that system revolved around money and social status. The wealthy got their own special area called the Baron's Ward, or Gentleman's Quarter. These weren't luxurious hotel rooms, but they were definitely a step up from what everyone else got. Rich prisoners could rent actual beds with mattresses instead of sleeping on straw. They had access to fireplaces during winter months. Some even brought their own servants to cook meals and wash clothes. The irony: many of these wealthy inmates were in prison for debt, meaning they'd run out of money on the outside but somehow still had enough to buy comfort on the inside. Then there was the Beggar's Ward, which sounds exactly as pleasant as you'd expect. This section housed the poorest prisoners who couldn't afford to pay for anything. They slept on bare stone floors or thin layers of rotting straw that hadn't been changed in months. No beds, no blankets, no pillows, just cold walls and whatever charity might trickle in from the outside world. The smell here was particularly awful since poor prisoners often couldn't afford soap or clean water for washing. Women always got separated from men, but the quality of their accommodations still depended on wealth. Rich women might get private cells with locks on the doors. Poor women crowded together in shared spaces that offered little privacy or safety. Female guards were extremely rare, so male jailers often controlled women's areas too. This created obvious problems that medieval society largely chose to ignore. Political prisoners presented a special challenge for jailers. These weren't common criminals or debtors. They were people who'd crossed kings, nobles, or church officials. Many came from wealthy families with connections and influence. Prison officials had to balance keeping them secure while not making enemies of powerful people who might someday be back in favor. The solution: tower chambers. These rooms were usually located in the highest parts of castle prisons or city jails. They offered better views, more light and cleaner air than basement cells. Tower chambers also made escape much harder since prisoners would have to climb down from dangerous heights. But the real advantage was psychological. Putting political prisoners up high kept them visible to the outside world, reassuring their supporters that they were still alive and relatively well treated. The strangest part about medieval prison organization was how fluid these boundaries could be. Money could move you from the beggar's ward to better quarters almost instantly. A prisoner who started poor might receive unexpected help from relatives or friends and suddenly find themselves in much nicer accommodations. Conversely, wealthy inmates who ran out of funds got moved downward fast. Some prisons had special sections for clergy members, though not all religious prisoners ended up there. Fake priests were common, people who claimed clerical status to get better treatment. Real clergy often got their own chapel areas where they could continue religious duties while imprisoned. This wasn't necessarily mercy. Church officials wanted to keep up appearances and maintain their authority even behind bars. Craftsmen and skilled workers sometimes got grouped together regardless of their crimes. Prison officials quickly realized that carpenters, blacksmiths, and stonemasons could be useful for maintaining the jail itself. These prisoners might get slightly better treatment in exchange for their labor, creating another unofficial class system within the prison walls. To most crowded areas were always the general wards where ordinary criminals mixed together. Thieves shared space with people imprisoned for fighting, adultery, or minor church violations. Age didn't matter much. Teenagers convicted of theft might find themselves next to elderly people imprisoned for debt. The noise in these areas was constant, with arguments, crying, and general chaos echoing off stone walls day and night. Regional differences meant that prison organization varied wildly across medieval Europe. English prisons might separate inmates one way while French jails used completely different systems. German territories often had their own local customs that determined who went where. What remained consistent was the basic principle: money and status determined comfort level. Interestingly, some prisoners chose to stay in lower quality areas even when they could afford better accommodations. They might want to avoid attention, gather information from other inmates, or simply preferred the company of common criminals over wealthy prisoners. These choices puzzled jailers but were generally allowed as long as payment arrangements were clear. But room assignments were just the beginning of prison life. Once you knew where you'd be sleeping and who your neighbors were, the real challenges started. Tidy routines, rules, and restrictions would soon make it clear that medieval prison was about much more than just finding a place to rest your head. Walking through those prison doors meant your real troubles were just beginning. The moment jailers slammed that heavy wooden door behind you, the sound echoed like a death knell. Your freedom, gone. Your comfort, about to disappear completely. First thing they did was chain you up, not the dramatic movie chains you might expect, but practical iron restraints that meant business. Most prisoners found themselves shackled to stone walls with heavy iron cuffs around their wrists. The metal was cold, rough, and designed to remind you exactly where you stood in the world, which was nowhere good. These weren't decorative accessories either. Medieval handcuffs were thick, crude pieces of iron that rubbed your skin raw within hours. The connecting chains allowed just enough movement to eat or lie down, but forget about stretching or walking around freely. Some unfortunate souls got chained directly to the floor, crouched in positions that would make a yoga instructor weep. The really unlucky prisoners faced something called close confinement. This meant being chained so tightly they could barely move at all. Imagine trying to sleep, eat, or relieve yourself while your hands are locked above your head or behind your back. Not exactly the medieval vacation package anyone ordered. But here's where things get interesting. Not every prisoner got the full restraint treatment. Your social status, the crime you committed, and how much money you could throw around all determined your level of chains. Rich merchants might get loose shackles that allowed decent movement. Poor thieves, they got the full iron treatment that left permanent scars. T-guards enforced a strict daily routine from day one. Wake up at dawn whether you wanted to or not. Eat when they brought food, not when you felt hungry. Sleep when darkness fell regardless of your preferred bedtime. The monotony was mind-numbing and completely intentional. Breaking your spirit was part of the punishment package. Speaking of guards, these weren't your friendly neighborhood watch types. Medieval jailers were tough, often cruel men who saw prisoners as less than human. They carried heavy keys that jangled ominously, thick wooden clubs for discipline, and attitudes that would make modern prison guards seem like kindergarten teachers. Cross them, and your already miserable life got infinitely worse. The lack of sunlight hit prisoners hard and fast. Most cells had tiny windows, if any at all. Some were completely underground with zero natural light. Your skin would turn pale and sickly within weeks. Your eyes would struggle to adjust when you occasionally glimpsed daylight. The psychological impact was devastating but perfectly calculated. Fresh air became a luxury you'd forgotten existed. Prison air was thick, stale, and filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and rotting straw. Every breath reminded you that you were trapped in a place where normal human comforts didn't exist. Some prisoners developed breathing problems that lasted long after their release. Daily life settled into a grinding routine that would drive anyone crazy. Wake up in chains. Sit in chains. Eat terrible food while chained. Stare at stone walls. Listen to other prisoners cough, cry, or go slowly insane. Sleep fitfully while still chained up. Repeat this cycle day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. The psychological torture was often worse than the physical restraints. Your mind started playing tricks after days of sensory deprivation and social isolation. Some prisoners talked to themselves, others to imaginary companions. The lucky ones found fellow inmates to chat with, but even conversation got stale when you're discussing the same stone walls for the 100th time. Guards made arbitrary rules that changed without notice. Maybe talking was forbidden on Tuesdays. Perhaps looking directly at a guard earned you a beating. The uncertainty kept prisoners constantly on edge, never knowing what might trigger punishment. This unpredictability was another tool to break down resistance and hope. Movement became a precious commodity. Those few steps your chains allowed felt like epic journeys. Prisoners would pace back and forth in their tiny range of motion, just to feel like they still had some control over their bodies. The human need to move freely turned into desperate, repetitive shuffling within iron constraints. Time moved differently in medieval prisons. Minutes felt like hours. Days blended into each other until you lost track completely. Some prisoners scratched marks on walls to count days, but many gave up when the marks became too depressing to continue. The outside world continued its rhythm while prison time stood still. Then there's the matter of basic human dignity. Chained prisoners couldn't clean themselves properly, couldn't maintain any privacy, and couldn't perform basic bodily functions without humiliation. The systematic stripping away of human dignity was as much a punishment as the physical restraints themselves. But the worst part, this was just the beginning. The chains, the guards, the monotony were all just setting the stage for everything else that came with medieval prison life. And trust me, if you thought getting chained up was rough, wait until you discovered what passed for food in these places. Medieval prisoners didn't exactly enjoy gourmet dining experiences. Food was often the difference between survival and a slow, miserable death. Poor prisoners faced constant hunger, while wealthy inmates could buy their way to decent meals. The whole system turned eating into another form of punishment or privilege. Gruel topped the menu for most prisoners. This watery mixture of oats or barley created a thin, tasteless soup that barely qualified as food. Jailers boiled whatever cheap grains they could find, added water, and called it a meal. Sometimes they threw in scraps of vegetables or meat that had seen better days. The result, a grey, lumpy mess that prisoners choked down because they had no choice. Stale bread came standard with prison life. Loaves sat around for days or weeks before reaching prisoners' hands, hard as rocks, mouldy around the edges, and often crawling with weevils. Prisoners learned to break off the worst parts and soak the rest in whatever liquid they could find. Fresh bread, that was a luxury reserved for inmates with deep pockets. Water quality varied from questionable to downright dangerous. Many prisons drew water from wells that hadn't been cleaned in years. Others relied on rivers that doubled as sewage dumps for entire towns. Prisoners often received dirty, brackish water that tasted like mud and smelled worse. Some jails rationed water strictly, leaving inmates constantly thirsty. Clean drinking water became as precious as gold. Then there's the matter of who controlled the food supply. Jailers held complete power over what prisoners ate, and when they ate it. This created endless opportunities for corruption and cruelty. Guards would withhold meals as punishment, demand bribes for better portions, or simply steal food meant for prisoners. Some jailers sold decent meals to the highest bidders while letting poor inmates starve. Malnutrition plagued prisoners who couldn't afford better treatment. Scurvy, caused by lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, left prisoners with bleeding gums and loose teeth. Rickets weakened bones in children unfortunate enough to land in prison. Many inmates wasted away from simple starvation, their bodies consuming muscle and fat until only skin and bones remained. Prison records from the time mention prisoners becoming too weak to stand or work. Wealthy prisoners lived in a completely different world when it came to food. They could purchase fresh meat, decent bread, ale, and even spices to make their meals palatable. Some rich inmates employed personal cooks or had family members bring elaborate meals from outside. These prisoners ate better in jail than many free peasants did in their daily lives. Money transformed prison dining from torture into something almost comfortable. The timing of meals followed no consistent schedule. Some prisons served food once a day, others twice if prisoners were lucky. Meals might arrive at dawn, noon, or sunset depending on the jailer's mood or workload. Prisoners never knew when their next meal would come, creating constant anxiety about food. Missing a meal meant going hungry until the next scheduled feeding, whenever that might be. Charity organizations sometimes provided food for poor prisoners, but these donations came with their own problems. Church groups or wealthy benefactors would occasionally send bread, soup, or other provisions to local jails. However, jailers frequently intercepted these charitable gifts and sold them for personal profit. The food that actually reached prisoners was often the worst quality stuff that jailers couldn't sell elsewhere. Kitchen scraps became valuable commodities inside prison walls. Prisoners who worked in jail kitchens could sometimes sneak extra portions or save leftover food for later. Bones with bits of meat, vegetable peelings, and bread crusts all had value in the prison economy. Inmates traded these scraps like currency, bartering for information, protection, or other small favors. Seasonal changes affected prison food quality dramatically. Summer brought fresh vegetables and fruits that might occasionally reach prisoners' bowls. Winter meant months of preserved meats, root vegetables, and whatever dried grains the jailers had stored. Spring was often the worst time for food quality, as winter stores ran low and new crops hadn't yet been harvested. Prisoners faced their hungriest months just as winter ended. The weird part is how some prisoners adapted to these terrible conditions. They learned to catch and eat rats, insects, and other creatures that shared their cells. Desperate inmates chewed on leather, straw, and anything else that might provide some nutrition. Some developed incredible tolerance for spoiled food that would have made free people violently ill. Storage methods made food problems even worse. Prisons lacked proper facilities for keeping food fresh or safe. Meat spoiled quickly in warm weather, grain attracted rodents and insects, and bread molded in damp conditions. Jailers served this contaminated food anyway, causing frequent outbreaks of food poisoning among prisoners. But poor nutrition was just one piece of the prison puzzle. The question of what prisoners did with their time becomes crucial when you're weak from hunger and stuck in a cell. Many jails found ways to put their inmates to work, creating another layer of medieval prison life that shaped daily survival. Medieval prisons weren't just places where people sat around feeling sorry for themselves. Many inmates found themselves with jobs to do, whether they wanted them or not. The idea that prisoners should work wasn't some modern invention, no. It was alive and kicking in castle dungeons and town jails centuries ago. Prison work came in all shapes and sizes. Someone had to clean the filthy cells, repair broken doors, and haul water from wells. Kitchen duties meant stirring massive pots of gruel and scrubbing dishes with whatever soap could be found. The more disgusting the job, the more likely it ended up assigned to whoever couldn't pay their way out of it. Cleaning was probably the most common prison job. Makes sense, right? These places were crawling with rats, covered in filth, and smelled like a combination of rotting food and human waste. Prisoners swept floors, emptied chamber pots, and tried to make their living spaces slightly less revolting. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People locked up for crimes were the ones keeping the prison somewhat livable for everyone else. Then there were the repair jobs. Castle prisons needed constant maintenance. Stone walls cracked, wooden doors rotted, and iron bars rusted away. Prisoners with carpentry or masonry skills found themselves fixing the very structures that kept them locked up. Talk about job satisfaction issues. Some inmates actually became quite good at these trades during their stay, though escaping through a hole you just repaired wasn't exactly encouraged. Kitchen work offered both advantages and serious drawbacks. Being near the food meant better chances of eating decent meals, or at least getting larger portions, but it also meant working in hot, steamy conditions while handling the same terrible ingredients that made prison food so awful. Prisoners chopped vegetables, tended fires, and served meals to fellow inmates. The wealthy prisoners eating in their comfortable cells rarely thought about who prepared their upgraded dinners. Some prisons assigned inmates to work outside the jail walls during daytime hours. This sounds like an escape opportunity waiting to happen, but medieval towns were small places where everyone knew everyone else's business. A prisoner trying to blend in and disappear would stick out like a sore thumb. These outdoor workers might tend gardens, collect firewood, or help with construction projects around town. Skilled labor was actually valued in medieval prisons. A prisoner who could read and write might help with record keeping. Someone with blacksmith experience could repair chains and shackles made us again. The equipment used to restrain them. Tailors mended clothing for guards and fellow prisoners. These specialized jobs sometimes came with small privileges, like slightly better food or a corner spot in the cell. But here's where things get interesting. Most prison work came without pay. Prisoners weren't earning wages for their efforts. Instead, work was seen as part of their punishment, or as a way to reduce their sentence time. Good behavior on work detail might shave days or weeks off someone's stay. Bad behavior, laziness, or refusing to work could extend their punishment considerably. The system wasn't entirely without rewards, though. Prisoners who worked hard sometimes received extra food, cleaner bedding, or small favors from guards. A jailer might look the other way when family members visited, or allow a brief walk in the courtyard. These tiny benefits meant everything to people living in harsh conditions. Work also provided mental relief from the crushing boredom of prison life. Sitting in a dark cell day after day drove people toward madness. Having tasks to complete, even unpleasant ones, gave inmates something to focus on besides their circumstances. It kept hands busy and minds occupied. Not everyone worked, of course. Wealthy prisoners could usually buy their way out of labor duties. Political prisoners were sometimes considered too important or dangerous to be given jobs that might facilitate escape attempts. Seriously ill inmates couldn't handle physical labor, though they rarely received much sympathy for their condition. The weird part is that some prisoners actually volunteered for extra work. Better to be exhausted from scrubbing floors than to spend endless hours staring at stone walls. All work created a routine, something predictable in an otherwise unpredictable existence. Prison administrators loved the system because it kept costs down. Why hire outside workers when you had a captive labor force? Inmates maintained their own facilities, prepared their own food, and kept the place running. It was a self-sustaining operation that benefited everyone except the prisoners doing the actual work. Whether prisoners were stirring soup or repairing walls, they were under constant supervision. Guards watched for signs of rebellion, escape attempts, or simple laziness. The threat of punishment hung over every work detail, making sure inmates stayed focused on their tasks rather than plotting their freedom. Yet even the hardest working prisoners remained at the mercy of their jailers, who controlled every aspect of prison life with an iron fist. Having guards control your life is one thing, but medieval jailers, they turned corruption into an art form. These weren't professional corrections officers with training manuals and oversight committees. Most jailers bought their positions like purchasing a business franchise, expecting to turn a profit from human misery. The transaction was surprisingly straightforward. A wealthy merchant or minor noble would pay the local lord for the right to run a prison. From that moment forward, every penny squeezed from prisoners went straight into their pockets. Food, bedding, candles, even basic drinking water, all carried price tags that would make modern hospital bills look reasonable. But here's where things get really twisted. Jailers didn't just charge for necessities, they invented creative fee structures that would impress today's airlines. Want your chains loosened so you can sleep? That'll cost extra. Need to send a message to your family? Pay up. Hoping for a cell with slightly less rat activity? Better dig deep into those pockets. The corruption ran deeper than simple price gouging. Many jailers pocketed charitable donations meant for poor prisoners. When kind-hearted townsfolk dropped off bread, blankets, or coins for the destitute inmates, these supplies mysteriously disappeared. The jailer's family ate well while prisoners starved just yards away. Some jailers sold the same donated bread back to prisoners at inflated prices. Then there's the protection racket aspect that made medieval jails feel like organized crime operations. Prisoners quickly learned that crossing the jailer meant more than just losing privileges. It could mean getting moved to the dampest cell, receiving spoiled food, or finding yourself shackled in positions that made sleep impossible. Smart inmates paid what amounted to protection money for basic human treatment. Female prisoners faced additional dangers that authorities largely ignored. Some jailers demanded sexual favors in exchange for better conditions or basic necessities. Others threatened to move women to cells with violent male prisoners unless they cooperated. The system offered virtually no recourse for abuse victims, since who would believe a criminal's word against a jailer's? Wealthy prisoners discovered they could essentially buy their way into luxury accommodations that rivaled decent inns. Rich inmates paid for private rooms, hired servants to attend them, and even hosted dinner parties within prison walls. Meanwhile, poor prisoners literally starved to death in the same building. The contrast was so stark that some wealthy prisoners lived better than free peasants outside. Power went to many jailers' heads in spectacular ways. They developed god complexes within their small domains, making arbitrary rules and changing them on whims. One jailer might decide prisoners could only speak during certain hours. Another banned all religious practices except his preferred prayers. Some forced inmates to perform humiliating tasks for entertainment or made them compete for basic privileges. Documentation from the period reveals jailers who charged prisoners for their own arrest paperwork. Getting booked into jail cost money, getting processed cost more money, and getting released, you guessed it, another fee. Prisoners without funds sometimes stayed locked up indefinitely, not because their sentences required it, but because they couldn't afford the administrative costs of freedom. The truly clever jailers turned their operations into full-service businesses. They lent money to prisoners at outrageous interest rates, sold luxury items at markup prices that would embarrass modern concert venues, and even ran gambling operations within the cells. Some prisoners left jail owing more money than when they entered, creating cycles of debt that led straight back to imprisonment. Yet not every jailer was completely crooked. A few took their responsibilities seriously, ensuring prisoners received adequate food and treating them with basic human dignity. These ethical jailers often struggled financially, since they couldn't bring themselves to exploit desperate people. Ironically, the honest ones were sometimes fired for not generating enough profit from their human inventory. Prisoners developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with corrupt jailers. They formed groups to pool resources for bribes, created communication networks to warn newcomers about specific jailers' schemes, and sometimes organized boycotts of jailer-provided services. The smarter prisoners learned to play jailers against each other when multiple staff members worked the same facility. The absence of meaningful oversight meant jailers answered to virtually no one except the lords who appointed them. As long as major prisoners didn't escape and no prominent families complained about their treatment, jailers operated with near-complete autonomy. This independence bred the kind of creative corruption that would make modern politicians jealous. What's particularly disturbing is how normalized this exploitation became. Society expected jailers to profit from prisoners, viewing it as a legitimate business model rather than systematic abuse. The idea that imprisonment itself was punishment enough hadn't taken hold yet. Instead, jail time was just the beginning of financial extraction. Understanding how these medieval jailers operated helps explain why prison conditions varied so dramatically, even within the same facility. Your experience depended entirely on your relationship with the person holding the keys. But even the most corrupt jailer couldn't control every aspect of prison life, especially when it came to the fascinating mix of people crammed together in these medieval institutions. Picture walking into a medieval prison and finding your cell packed with the strangest mix of people you've ever seen. Your new roommate might be a pickpocket, a prostitute who couldn't pay her fines, or a beggar caught sleeping in the wrong doorway. Medieval prisons weren't organized like modern jails where criminals got separated by their crimes. Everyone just got thrown together in one big, chaotic mess. The system made no sense by today's standards. A man who owed money to a baker could end up chained next to someone accused of witchcraft. Women who sold their bodies illegally shared space with women who couldn't pay church taxes. Debtors sat alongside heretics, and petty thieves bunked with political prisoners. The authorities didn't care about creating some neat filing system for human beings. But here's where things get really weird. Medieval prisons weren't sealed off from the outside world like fortresses. Visitors could walk right in, sometimes bringing along extra people who weren't even supposed to be there. Guards often looked the other way when family members smuggled in friends, servants, or anyone else willing to pay a small fee. Some prisons became so crowded with unofficial inmates that jailers lost track of who actually belonged there. Let's not forget that many of these strange roommates weren't even convicted of anything. Medieval justice moved slower than a three-legged horse, so people waited months or years for trials that might never come. A woman accused of stealing bread could spend 2 years sharing a cell with someone still waiting to hear charges for disturbing the peace. The uncertainty created its own kind of madness. Then there's the social mixing that happened naturally. Rich prisoners who could afford better food often shared meals with poor inmates, creating unlikely friendships. A nobleman's son caught poaching might end up playing dice with a common thief. These relationships crossed class lines in ways that rarely happened outside prison walls. Makes sense, right? When you're all stuck in the same miserable situation, social rank starts mattering less. Wealthy inmates discovered they could buy privacy, but even they couldn't escape the chaos completely. A merchant who paid extra for his own corner still had to deal with the constant noise, arguments, and general pandemonium of dozens of people crammed into spaces meant for half that number. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy silence. And the weird part is how some prisoners became permanent residents by choice. Elderly beggars with nowhere else to go, sometimes committed small crimes just to get arrested again. Prison offered them food, shelter, and companionship they couldn't find on the streets. These repeat customers knew all the other regulars and created their own informal communities within the jail walls. The mixing got even stranger during festivals and holy days. Local customs sometimes required prisoners to participate in community celebrations. Guards would march entire groups of inmates to town squares for religious ceremonies or seasonal festivals. Picture a parade of chained debtors, prostitutes, and thieves shuffling through streets to attend Easter Mass alongside regular citizens. Women prisoners faced particularly odd situations. Female inmates got housed separately when possible, but smaller jails couldn't afford the luxury of gender separation. Women found themselves sharing space with men they'd never choose to associate with under normal circumstances. A baker's wife imprisoned for debt might end up next to a highway robber and a monk who'd broken his vows. Prostitutes created their own sub-community within many prisons. They knew the system better than most inmates because they got arrested regularly. These women often became informal guides for newcomers, explaining which guards accepted bribes when mealtimes happened and how to avoid the worst troublemakers. Their experience made them valuable allies in an otherwise hostile environment. Some of the strangest roommate situations involved clergy, priests, monks, and nuns who broke religious laws. Sometimes ended up in regular prisons instead of church facilities. Imagine being a common thief and suddenly having to share your sleeping space with a disgraced monk who'd been caught embezzling church funds. The conversations alone must have been fascinating, but the most bizarre mixing happened when entire families got imprisoned together. Medieval law sometimes held family members responsible for each other's debts or crimes. Children, parents, grandparents, and distant relatives could all end up in the same cell, creating a twisted family reunion behind bars. These family clusters added another layer of complexity to already complicated social dynamics. The chaos of medieval prison roommates created its own survival strategies. Inmates learned to form alliances across traditional social boundaries. A prostitute might protect a young debtor in exchange for help reading legal documents. A skilled craftsman could trade repair work for food from wealthier prisoners. Everyone found ways to navigate the strange social landscape. Yet this mixing of different types of people wasn't entirely accidental. Medieval authorities understood that prisons served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment. But what prisoners did with their time once they'd figured out how to live with their strange roommates, that depended on how much contact they could maintain with the world beyond those prison walls. Medieval prisons weren't sealed-off dungeons where inmates vanished from society forever. That Hollywood image misses something crucial about how these places actually worked. Prisoners maintained surprisingly regular contact with the outside world, and the boundaries between jail and community were often more like suggestions than iron walls. Visitors wandered in and out of most prisons with shocking ease. Family members brought food, news, and supplies to their imprisoned relatives. Friends stopped by for conversations. Even complete strangers sometimes toured prisons out of curiosity or religious duty. Guards rarely questioned these visits unless someone caused obvious trouble. The physical layout of medieval prisons made this mingling almost inevitable. Many jails sat right inside city gates or castle courtyards where daily business happened. People walked past prison windows while conducting normal activities. Conversations flowed freely between inmates and passers-by. Some prisoners could literally stick their hands through bars to receive donations or messages from townspeople. Then there's the matter of temporary freedom. Wealthy prisoners sometimes negotiated day passes to handle business affairs or attend family events. A merchant imprisoned for debt might convince his jailer to let him visit his shop to arrange payment. These agreements usually involved hefty bribes, but they happened more often than you'd expect. Religious festivals created even stranger mixing opportunities. During major holy days, some prisons opened their doors wider than usual. Prisoners joined community celebrations, attended church services, or received special meals provided by charitable organizations. The line between captivity and participation blurred considerably during these times. Prison staff themselves facilitated much of this social mixing. Jailers often lived on site with their families, creating a neighborhood atmosphere rather than an institutional one. Guards' children played in prison courtyards. Wives cooked meals that might be shared with inmates who could afford them. The jailer's home and the prison became one interconnected space. But here's where things get really interesting. Some prisoners essentially ran businesses from their cells. They sold goods to visitors, provided services to fellow inmates, or continued their trades when materials could be smuggled inside. A skilled craftsman might repair items for townspeople with payment passed through the bars. These arrangements required constant interaction with the outside world. Communication networks flourished in this environment. Messages traveled rapidly between prisoners and their contacts in town. Political news, business information, and personal gossip flowed freely. Some prisoners stayed better informed about current events than isolated country villagers. The weird part is that authorities often tolerated this information exchange unless it threatened their direct interests. Charitable visitors made regular rounds to most prisons. Religious organizations, wealthy families, and community groups brought food, clothing, and supplies to needy inmates. These charity visits weren't just quick drop-offs either. Benefactors often spent time talking with prisoners, hearing their stories and assessing their needs. Some developed ongoing relationships that lasted throughout a prisoner's sentence. The mixing wasn't always voluntary or pleasant though. Beggars, prostitutes, and various outcasts often sheltered near prison grounds, creating impromptu communities around these institutions. Disputes, trading, and social hierarchies developed naturally when different groups clustered together. Guards sometimes ignored minor conflicts that didn't disrupt their main responsibilities. Female prisoners faced unique social situations. Women's wards often housed inmates alongside their young children, who weren't technically prisoners but couldn't survive elsewhere. These children moved freely between the prison and surrounding areas, carrying messages and maintaining family connections. Their presence softened the institutional atmosphere considerably. Professional relationships continued across prison walls too. Lawyers met with clients regularly. Priests provided spiritual counsel. Doctors visited when families could afford treatment. These professional visits weren't just brief consultations but often extended meetings where complex matters got discussed and resolved. Market activities happened right outside many prison walls. Vendors sold food, tools, and other necessities to visitors and inmates alike. Some prisoners coordinated purchases through family members or friends. Money changed hands constantly, and commercial relationships adapted to accommodate the prison's physical constraints. Local authorities generally accepted this social mixing as normal and necessary. Complete isolation would have required expensive security measures that most communities couldn't afford. Besides, maintaining family and community ties supposedly helped prisoners reintegrate after release. The system worked through accommodation rather than absolute control. Weather and seasons affected these social patterns significantly. Summer brought more outdoor gatherings and casual interactions. Winter forced people closer together in heated spaces, intensifying relationships between inmates and visitors. Prison courtyards became community gathering spots during favorable weather. The most surprising aspect might be how prisoners sometimes knew more about local affairs than free citizens. Their central location and constant stream of visitors created information hubs where news converged from multiple sources. Makes sense, right? When people from all social levels visit regularly, conversations cover everything happening in town. This open system created opportunities that would shock modern prison administrators. But understanding these social connections reveals something important about medieval justice. Punishment aimed to shame and restrict rather than completely separate offenders from society. Yet all this mixing and socializing had its limits, especially when authorities decided someone posed a genuine threat. Some prisoners found themselves cut off from normal contact patterns, facing isolation that felt much harsher after experiencing community connection. Most prisoners never even thought about escaping. Why would they? Medieval jails weren't exactly maximum security fortresses with guard towers and razor wire. But here's the thing, breaking out was surprisingly possible, yet incredibly stupid at the same time. The actual escape part was often laughably easy. Remember those damp stone walls we talked about earlier? Well, centuries of moisture had a way of loosening mortar between stones. A determined prisoner with time on their hands could literally pick away at walls until they crumbled. Some cells had wooden doors that were more rotten than solid. Others had windows with iron bars that rust had weakened beyond belief. Then there's the guard situation, which was honestly a joke half the time. Many jailers were part-time workers who doubled as shopkeepers or farmers. They'd wander off to tend their other business, leaving prisoners basically unsupervised for hours. Some guards fell asleep during night shifts, especially after sharing ale with cooperative inmates who'd gained their trust over months of good behavior. But here comes the real problem. Where exactly do you go after breaking out? Medieval towns weren't sprawling metropolises where you could disappear into anonymous crowds. Most communities had fewer than 1,000 people, and everyone knew everyone else's business. A stranger walking into town would be spotted immediately, especially if they looked hungry, dirty, or desperate. The countryside wasn't much better as a hiding spot. Forests were controlled by royal game wardens who knew every path and clearing. Villages were small, tight-knit communities where outsiders stuck out like sore thumbs. Traveling merchants and pilgrims carried proper documentation or traveled in recognizable groups. A lone escapee had nowhere to blend in. What's more, medieval society operated on a web of connections and obligations. Every person belonged somewhere to a lord, a guild, a parish, or a family. Being completely unattached made you instantly suspicious. People would assume you were either a criminal, a runaway serf, or worse. No one would risk harboring someone without proper status or connections. Some prisoners did manage creative escapes though. Records tell of inmates who convinced guards they were actually visitors who'd been accidentally locked in during routine cell checks. Others faked serious illnesses, hoping to be moved to infirmaries with lighter security. A few even attempted to bribe their way out, though this rarely worked since most prisoners lacked the substantial funds needed to buy a jailer's silence permanently. The most successful escapees were usually political prisoners with outside supporters. These folks had networks of allies who could provide safe houses, forged documents, or passage to distant territories. Even then, success often meant permanent exile from their homeland, never to see family or property again. Church sanctuary offered one legitimate escape route. If a prisoner could reach a church or cathedral, they could claim sanctuary and avoid immediate recapture. But sanctuary came with its own problems. You had to confess your crimes publicly, renounce your possessions, and agree to permanent exile. Plus, you could only stay in sanctuary for 40 days before being forced to leave the realm forever. Getting caught after an escape attempt made everything infinitely worse. Judges viewed escaping as proof of guilt and defiance of royal authority. Punishments escalated dramatically. A debtor who broke out might suddenly face branding or mutilation. Someone originally facing a few months in jail could find themselves sentenced to years of hard labor or even execution. The physical act of escaping could be dangerous too. Prisoners who tried to climb down castle walls sometimes fell to their deaths. Others drowned attempting to swim across moats or rivers. Winter escapes were particularly deadly. Freedom meant little if you froze to death in the first night outside. Most failed escape attempts happened within days of the original breakout. Escapes would be spotted stealing food, sleeping in barns, or begging in nearby villages. Local officials offered rewards for recapturing escaped prisoners, encouraging everyone from farmers to merchants to keep their eyes open for suspicious strangers. But the weird part is that some prisoners escaped and were never heard from again. Whether they died in the wilderness, successfully fled to distant lands, or simply adopted new identities in remote communities remains a mystery. Medieval record-keeping wasn't comprehensive enough to track every runaway's fate. The bottom line was simple. Escaping medieval prison was often physically possible, but practically pointless. The punishment system relied more on social control than physical barriers. Running away meant abandoning your entire life, family, property, and legal status. For most people, serving out their sentence was the smarter choice. Of course, not every prisoner had the luxury of simply waiting out their time. Some faced threats far more dangerous than recapture. Disease and death stalked medieval jails with frightening regularity, creating dangers that made escape attempts look almost reasonable by comparison. Death came knocking on medieval prison doors more often than you'd think. Not from torture or starvation, though those played their part. The real killer, disease spreading through cramped, filthy cells like wildfire through dry grass. Fever struck first and hardest. Prisoners would wake up shivering one morning, burning hot by afternoon. Their cellmates watched helplessly as temperatures soared beyond control. No thermometers existed back then, but jailers knew the signs. Sweating, mumbling nonsense, then the final stillness. What we might call typhus or influenza today went by simpler names. Prison fever covered most illnesses that left bodies piled up by morning. The plague made occasional visits too, though not as dramatically as you might expect. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 1300s, it hit prisons hard but didn't wipe them out completely. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried disease, and prisoners couldn't exactly call an exterminator. Some lucky inmates actually got released early, when authorities panicked about plague spreading to the outside world. Talk about a twisted form of mercy. Medical help, that's generous. Most jailers had zero training in anything resembling healthcare. Their solution to illness was simple: move the sick prisoner to a corner and hope for the best. If they died, drag the body out. If they recovered, charge them extra for surviving. The few physicians who occasionally visited prisons weren't exactly the cream of the medical crop either. What's surprising is how many prisoners actually survived. Death rates in medieval prisons weren't as astronomical as modern movies suggest. Poor sanitation definitely made things worse, but humans are tougher than we give them credit for. Some jails even kept decent health records, showing that most inmates lived through their sentences despite the horrible conditions. Then there's the weird part about how disease spread. Rich prisoners in their private chambers sometimes caught fewer illnesses than poor inmates crammed together. Money couldn't buy immunity, but it could buy space, and space meant fewer germy cellmates breathing on you all night. The beggar's ward turned into a petri dish of whatever plague was fashionable that season. Dysentery hit almost everyone eventually. Bad water, spoiled food, and zero understanding of hygiene created perfect conditions for stomach bugs that could kill. Prisoners called it the flux and dreaded it more than beatings. At least pain from torture ended eventually. Dysentery could drag on for weeks, leaving victims weak and dehydrated until they simply gave up. Some prisons tried basic prevention methods, though not from any scientific understanding. Opening windows occasionally helped air circulation, even if jailers thought they were just being nice. Throwing lime around cells controlled smell and accidentally killed some germs. Pure luck masquerading as pest control. Epidemics occasionally swept through entire prison wards, leaving them nearly empty. When this happened, authorities faced a practical problem. Dead prisoners couldn't pay their fees or work their sentences. Some jailers actually lost money when disease struck their most profitable inmates. The wealthy political prisoners represented serious income streams, so their deaths hurt the jailer's wallet directly. Winter brought different health challenges. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes in unheated cells. Pneumonia followed close behind, especially for prisoners who arrived in summer clothes and never got warmer gear. Some inmates literally froze to death, while others in the same prison survived just fine. Location mattered. A cell near the kitchen stayed warmer than one by the outer wall. Mental health suffered alongside physical health, though nobody understood the connection. Prisoners who went mad were often assumed to be faking it, or possessed by demons. Depression looked like laziness. Anxiety seemed like cowardice. The few who recovered from serious mental breaks were considered miraculously cured rather than naturally healed. Pregnant women faced especially dangerous situations. Childbirth in a dirty prison cell with no medical assistance killed many mothers and babies. Some jailers showed mercy by moving pregnant inmates to slightly cleaner areas, but this was kindness, not policy. The babies who survived often grew up in prison until their mothers' sentences ended. Infectious diseases didn't discriminate by crime either. A nobleman imprisoned for treason could catch the same deadly fever as a peasant jailed for stealing bread. Death was one of the few truly democratic experiences in medieval prisons. Your social status meant nothing to typhus or plague. But here's what's fascinating about all this illness and death. Prison communities often developed their own forms of care. Experienced inmates taught newcomers which water sources were safest, which foods to avoid, and how to spot early signs of serious illness. These survival networks operated entirely outside official prison management. While disease claimed many lives, it wasn't the systematic killer that movies portray. Most prisoners faced the constant threat of illness without actually dying from it. They lived in fear of the next outbreak, knowing they had little control over their fate. Which brings us to another form of suffering that authorities controlled much more directly. Medieval torture wasn't quite the Hollywood horror show you might expect. Sure, it happened, but not every prisoner got the full medieval treatment. Most people think dungeons were basically torture chambers where screaming echoed through stone corridors all day long. The reality, way more complicated than that. Torture served a specific purpose in medieval justice. It wasn't random cruelty or sadistic entertainment. Courts used it primarily to extract confessions from people who refused to admit their crimes. Think of it as a twisted form of legal procedure rather than pure punishment. Judges believed that without a confession they couldn't be completely certain someone was guilty. Makes sense in a weird way, right? No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no security cameras back then. The whole system operated on a simple premise: tell us what we want to hear, and the pain stops. Most torture sessions weren't designed to kill or permanently maim prisoners. They aimed to break down resistance and get people talking. Sometimes it worked within minutes. Other times stubborn prisoners held out for hours. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone faced torture. Your social class, the type of crime, and even your gender affected whether jailers strapped you to a wooden contraption or left you alone. Wealthy prisoners could often buy their way out of torture sessions entirely. Poor folks, well, they weren't so lucky. The wooden horse was probably the most popular torture device in medieval prisons. Picture a triangular wooden beam mounted on legs, kind of like a sawhorse but with a sharp ridge on top. Guards forced prisoners to straddle this thing, putting all their weight on the thin edge. Sounds uncomfortable, that's the point. Add some weights to their ankles, and the pain became unbearable pretty quickly. Stretching devices showed up in many castle dungeons too. These contraptions pulled prisoners' arms and legs in opposite directions, creating intense pressure on joints and muscles. The goal wasn't to tear people apart like in the movies. Instead, torturers applied just enough force to cause excruciating pain without permanent damage. Well, most of the time anyway. Then there's the fact that torture sessions were rarely private affairs. Many took place in public courtyards or semi-public spaces where other prisoners could watch. This served two purposes. It terrified other inmates into confessing their own crimes, and it showed the community that justice was being served. Medieval people believed that witnessing punishment helped deter future criminals. The weird part is that some torture methods were almost ritualistic. Torturers followed specific procedures and rules about how long sessions could last, what devices to use, and when to stop. Church law actually restricted certain types of torture, especially for clergy members. Even in their cruelty, medieval people maintained a twisted sense of order and protocol. Daily torture wasn't actually that common for most prisoners. Many inmates never experienced it at all. Jailers used the threat of torture as effectively as the actual practice. Just knowing that the wooden horse waited in the next room was enough to make lots of prisoners cooperative. Why endure the pain when you could confess immediately? Some prisoners faced psychological torture that was arguably worse than physical pain. Isolation, sleep deprivation, and constant threats could break down mental resistance just as effectively as stretching devices. Guards would describe in vivid detail what would happen if prisoners didn't cooperate. This mental warfare often worked better than actual torture. Weather played a role in torture effectiveness too. Cold winter days made already uncomfortable positions absolutely miserable. Prisoners strapped to outdoor devices faced not just the pain from restraints, but also freezing temperatures, rain or snow. Summer brought its own problems with heat, insects and dehydration, making every torture session worse. The strangest thing about medieval torture is that many prisoners survived it relatively intact. Death during torture was actually counterproductive since dead prisoners couldn't confess or provide information. Skilled torturers knew exactly how much pressure to apply without causing fatal injuries. They were craftsmen of pain, not butchers. Some regions had more brutal torture practices than others. Forest prisons, for instance, used particularly harsh methods on poachers who violated hunting laws. These specialized facilities dealt with crimes against royal property which carried severe penalties. Getting caught stealing the king's deer meant facing torture methods that regular criminal prisons rarely used. But torture wasn't the end of the story for most medieval prisoners. It was often just one part of a longer punishment process. Confession led to sentencing, which might involve more prison time, public humiliation or other penalties. The pain was a means to an end, not the final destination. Understanding medieval torture helps explain why prisoners developed such elaborate systems of mutual support and why jailers held so much power over daily prison life. When physical pain could arrive without warning, every aspect of prison existence became negotiable. But torture was just one tool jailers used to control their inmates. Walking into a medieval prison meant facing a world of metal and wood designed to make your life miserable. Restraints weren't just accessories, they were the main event. Iron handcuffs clamped around wrists like permanent bracelets nobody wanted to wear. Wooden stocks trapped ankles in uncomfortable positions for hours or even days. Heavy chains attached prisoners to stone walls, turning cells into human storage units. The variety was almost impressive, if you enjoyed that sort of thing. Some prisoners got the full treatment with shackles on both hands and feet, connected by chains that made walking sound like a one-person marching band. Others faced lighter restraints that still made daily life incredibly annoying. Try eating soup when your hands are locked in wooden blocks. Good luck with that. Well, the weight alone could break someone's spirit before the actual punishment began. Iron chains weren't exactly lightweight accessories. A full set of restraints could weigh 30 pounds or more, turning every movement into an exhausting workout. Prisoners often developed sores and cuts where metal rubbed against skin day after day. The constant clanking sound drove people half crazy too. But here's where it gets interesting. Not every prisoner faced the same level of restraint. Wealthy inmates sometimes paid jailers to use lighter chains or remove shackles during meals. Poor prisoners got the heaviest iron available, often rusted and deliberately uncomfortable. The difference between having money and being broke showed up in every link of chain wrapped around someone's limbs. Mobility became a luxury most prisoners couldn't afford. Heavy restraints meant shuffling rather than walking. Reaching for things became nearly impossible, and sleeping turned into a puzzle of finding positions that didn't cut off circulation. Some prisoners were chained directly to walls, limiting movement to just a few feet in any direction. Others got slightly longer chains that allowed movement within their cell. Though freedom meant different things when you're dragging 20 pounds of iron behind you, the clever part was how jailers used restraints as both punishment and control. Troublesome prisoners got heavier chains and tighter handcuffs. Cooperative inmates might earn slightly looser shackles or occasional removal during certain activities. This created a twisted reward system where basic human movement became something to be earned through good behavior. And the weird part is how creative medieval craftsmen got with restraint design. Handcuffs weren't just simple circles of metal. Some featured spikes on the inside that dug into wrists with movement. Others locked at angles that made hands almost useless for any task. Leg irons sometimes included extra chains that connected to waist restraints, creating full-body limitation systems that would impress modern engineers with their thorough awfulness. Then there were the wooden stocks, which deserve their own horror story. These devices trapped head and hands in holes cut through wooden boards, leaving prisoners bent over in extremely uncomfortable positions. Unlike iron restraints that allowed some movement, stocks forced complete immobilization. Prisoners couldn't lie down, stand up straight, or even scratch an itch without help from someone else. Let's not forget the psychological impact of being constantly restrained. The sound of chains became background music nobody wanted to hear. Simple tasks like drinking water or using chamber pots turned into major challenges requiring help or incredible creativity. Privacy disappeared completely when basic human functions needed assistance from guards or fellow prisoners. Some prisons took restraints to ridiculous extremes. Political prisoners might get specially designed chains that prevented writing or communication through hand gestures. Suspected escape artists faced restraints that made movement nearly impossible, turning cells into personal torture chambers where breathing deeply became the day's main exercise. The maintenance aspect was terrible too. Rusty chains caused infections that could turn deadly without proper medical care. Wooden stocks rotted in damp conditions, sometimes trapping prisoners in decaying restraints that crumbled while still locked around limbs. Jailers rarely cared about equipment condition as long as it kept prisoners contained. Makes sense, right? Maximum suffering with minimum effort on the guards' part. Why worry about prisoner comfort when the whole point was making life as miserable as possible? Fresh oil for squeaky chains wasn't exactly a budget priority when running a medieval prison operation. Different types of restraints served different purposes beyond just keeping people locked up. Heavy chains sent messages to other prisoners about what happened to troublemakers. Visible restraints reminded everyone about their place in the prison hierarchy. Light restraints for wealthy prisoners showed that money could buy slightly better treatment, even behind bars. The daily reality meant prisoners developed entire strategies around their restraints, learning to sleep while chained to walls, figuring out how to eat with limited hand movement, and finding ways to maintain some dignity while metal constantly reminded them of their situation. Every meal, every trip to use facilities, every conversation happened while wearing pounds of uncomfortable metal. But restraints were just one part of the medieval prison experience. While prisoners struggled with chains and shackles daily, something else shaped their time behind bars even more powerfully: the role religion played in prison life. Physical chains held prisoners to walls and floors, but spiritual chains bound their souls just as tightly. Medieval prisons didn't just punish your body, they wanted to fix your relationship with God too. Most jails required inmates to pray several times a day, not optional prayers either. Guards dragged people from their cells at dawn for mandatory morning prayers, then again at noon and evening. Miss a prayer session, extra time in shackles or reduced food rations. The logic was simple: if crime came from a corrupted soul, then salvation required constant communication with the Almighty. Priests wandered through prison corridors like spiritual doctors making rounds. They carried confession books, holy water, and stern expressions. These weren't gentle pastoral visits either. Prison chaplains had one job: squeeze repentance out of stubborn sinners through whatever means necessary. Here's where things got interesting though. Some prisoners actually welcomed these religious visits. Life in a damp cell with nothing but rats for company could drive anyone towards spiritual reflection. Having a priest to talk with, even a demanding one, broke the crushing monotony of prison life. But the church didn't stop at simple prayer requirements. Religious penance meant specific punishments designed to cleanse your soul while your body rotted in jail. Thieves might recite hundreds of Hail Marys while wearing heavy wooden crosses around their necks. Blasphemers got forced to memorize entire books of the Bible word for word before earning any privileges. The weirdest part? Some prisoners had to perform their penance publicly within the jail. Imagine being forced to crawl on your knees through prison corridors while chanting psalms, as other inmates watched and guards supervised. Pride got crushed along with kneecaps on those cold stone floors. Wealthy prisoners could sometimes buy their way out of the harshest religious punishments. Rich merchants hired private chaplains who went easier on confession requirements. Poor inmates got stuck with the strictest priests who seemed to believe poverty itself was evidence of spiritual failure requiring extra correction. Religious festivals created strange contradictions in medieval prisons. During Easter or Christmas, some jails allowed prisoners to participate in elaborate ceremonies. The same inmates who spent months in chains suddenly found themselves singing hymns and receiving communion alongside their guards. These moments of spiritual community felt surreal after weeks of isolation and punishment. Women prisoners faced additional religious burdens. Female inmates were often considered more spiritually corrupted than men, especially if their crimes involved sexuality or defying male authority. Nuns sometimes served as prison chaplains for women, bringing their own harsh interpretations of proper female behavior and spiritual submission. Let's not forget that medieval people truly believed in hell as a real place with actual fire and demons. Prison chaplains used this fear ruthlessly. They'd describe in vivid detail what awaited unrepentant souls after death, making current prison conditions seem pleasant by comparison. Psychological torture wrapped in spiritual concern. Some prisoners discovered genuine religious conversion during their time behind bars. Whether from desperation, boredom, or actual spiritual awakening, certain inmates became intensely devout. These converts often received better treatment from guards and fellow prisoners, though cynics suspected their newfound faith was mostly performance art designed to improve living conditions. Religious penance also shaped daily prison schedules in unexpected ways. Fasting periods meant even less food than usual. Holy days brought special punishments for those deemed insufficiently repentant. The church calendar controlled prison life as much as any jailer's rules. Confession created its own problems too. Priests who heard prisoner confessions learned about crimes, escape plans, and conflicts between inmates. Some chaplains kept these secrets, but others shared information with guards or local authorities. Spiritual counseling became another form of surveillance. Then there were the religious artifacts that filled medieval prisons. Crosses hung in every cell, not for comfort but as constant reminders of judgment and sacrifice. Holy books chained to tables, ironic, considering the readers were also chained, provided required reading material. Religious imagery covered walls, depicting saints who'd suffered for their faith, subtle hints about accepting punishment with grace. The most dedicated prisoners sometimes exceeded their required religious penance, creating additional spiritual exercises for themselves. They'd fast beyond what rules demanded, pray longer than required, or invent elaborate penitential rituals. Guards found these displays either admirable or suspicious, depending on their mood. Religious reform through imprisonment reflected medieval belief that earthly punishment could save souls from eternal damnation. Prison chaplains saw themselves as spiritual surgeons, cutting away sin through forced prayer, confession, and penance. Whether this approach actually reformed criminals remained debatable, but it certainly made prison life more complicated. Yet even the strictest religious requirements couldn't completely control prisoner behavior. Some inmates mocked prayers under their breath, others found ways to gamble using religious artifacts, and a few turned spiritual study sessions into opportunities for planning escapes or settling scores with fellow prisoners. While religious penance shaped daily prison life for most inmates, certain prisoners enjoyed completely different treatment based on their social status. The church hierarchy that demanded spiritual submission from common criminals offered special protections to their own members facing legal troubles. If you were a medieval priest caught stealing church silver, or a monk found drunk in the marketplace, claiming benefit of clergy might just save your neck. This legal loophole became one of the most exploited tricks of the Middle Ages. Any man who could prove he belonged to the church, or even just read a Bible verse, could demand transfer from brutal public prisons to much gentler church facilities. Church prisons operated under completely different rules. While regular inmates gnawed on moldy bread and slept on stone floors, clerical prisoners enjoyed proper meals, clean bedding, and heated rooms. The church took care of its own, even the troublemakers. These special facilities looked more like monastery guest houses than dungeons. Some featured private cells with wooden beds, writing desks, and access to libraries. Makes sense that everyone wanted in on this deal, right? The process worked like this. When arrested, a clergyman would immediately declare his clerical status and demand ecclesiastical trial. Local sheriffs had to honor this request, even if they suspected fraud. Church officials would then collect their wayward brother and transport him to religious custody. But here's where it gets interesting. Proving clergy status wasn't always straightforward. Medieval record-keeping was terrible. No official databases existed to verify who belonged to the church and who didn't. Clever criminals learned to fake clerical credentials with surprising success. They memorized Bible passages, practiced Latin phrases, and even shaved their heads to mimic the clerical tonsure. Some carried forged letters from bishops or fake holy relics as proof of their religious calling. Church authorities knew about this scam but often played along anyway. They preferred handling cases internally, rather than letting secular courts interfere with religious matters. Even obviously fake clergymen sometimes received protection if they seemed genuinely repentant. The church valued souls over strict legal procedures. Then there's the neck verse phenomenon. Psalm 51:1 became known as the neck verse because reading it could literally save your neck from the hangman's noose. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Countless criminals memorized this single Bible passage, hoping to convince judges of their literacy and clerical status. Judges usually knew the trick, but accepted it anyway. The system prioritized mercy over justice in many cases. Inside church prisons, daily life centered around prayer and penance rather than punishment. Morning services, afternoon study sessions, and evening prayers structured each day. Prisoners received spiritual counseling instead of physical torture. Some clerical facilities resembled religious retreats more than correctional institutions. Guards were often fellow clergymen, who emphasized rehabilitation through faith. Physical conditions varied dramatically from public dungeons. Church prisons featured better ventilation, cleaner water, and regular meal schedules. Wealthy church prisoners could purchase additional comforts: wine, books, personal servants, even visits from family members. Poor clerical inmates still lived simply, but they avoided the rats, chains, and disease plaguing secular facilities. Discipline focused on spiritual correction rather than bodily harm. Instead of whipping or stocks, disobedient prisoners faced extended fasting periods, isolation for prayer, or copying religious texts by hand. The most severe punishment might involve temporary excommunication, cutting off spiritual communion with the church community. For truly religious men, this represented genuine suffering. The system created obvious inequalities. A murderous monk might enjoy comfortable church custody while an innocent debtor rotted in a public cell. Secular authorities resented losing jurisdiction over serious crimes. Tensions between church and state courts frequently erupted over prisoner transfers and trial procedures. Some church prisons specialized in specific types of religious crimes. Heresy required different treatment than theft. Monastery facilities handled wayward monks, while cathedral prisons managed secular clergy issues. Each institution developed unique approaches to spiritual rehabilitation and punishment. Escape attempts were rare but not unknown. Church prisons relied more on honor systems than heavy security. Prisoners often gave their word not to flee, and most kept these promises. Running away meant abandoning any hope of religious protection and facing much harsher secular justice. Female religious prisoners presented special challenges. Nuns and other religious women needed separate facilities with appropriate supervision. Some convents operated their own small prisons for internal discipline. These women's religious prisons often emphasized silent reflection and manual labor like spinning or weaving. And the weird part is how this system actually worked reasonably well for centuries. Despite obvious loopholes and inequalities, benefit of clergy provided a functioning parallel justice system. It offered second chances to genuine clergymen, while creating escape routes for clever criminals. The church maintained its independence while secular authorities avoided difficult religious conflicts. But not everyone could claim clerical protection forever. By the late medieval period, authorities began tightening requirements and closing obvious loopholes. The rise of professional legal systems gradually reduced church jurisdiction over criminal matters. This clerical privilege system reveals how medieval society balanced competing authorities and values. While some prisoners enjoyed church protection and comfortable religious custody, others faced very different fates in noble households under carefully watched house arrest. While commoners rotted in damp cells chained to stone walls, nobles enjoyed a completely different prison experience. House arrest for the wealthy wasn't punishment. It was more like an extended vacation with guards. Medieval society operated on strict class divisions, and even imprisonment followed these rules. When a noble committed a crime or found themselves on the wrong side of politics, they rarely saw the inside of a dungeon. Instead, they were confined to comfortable castle apartments, manor houses, or luxurious chambers within fortress walls. The contrast was staggering. Take Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, imprisoned in 1312 for rebelling against King Edward II. Rather than chains and gruel, he lived in a tower room complete with tapestries, a proper bed, and servants to attend his needs. His cell had windows overlooking gardens, not rat-infested corners. He could write letters, receive visitors, and even host dinner parties. The only difference between his normal life and imprisonment: he couldn't leave the building. But why did nobles get such special treatment? Simple economics and politics. Executing or torturing a nobleman could start wars between families or regions. These weren't just criminals, they were valuable political assets, potential hostages, or future allies. Kings preferred keeping powerful enemies comfortable, rather than creating martyrs or blood feuds that could last generations. The arrangements were often quite civilized. A captured earl might negotiate his own terms of confinement, specifying which servants could attend him, what books he wanted access to, and even which wine should stock his quarters. Some noble prisoners brought their own furniture, personal cooks, and entertainers. Guards watched them constantly, but these weren't jailers. They were more like extremely attentive hotel staff. Women of noble birth received similar treatment. Lady Margaret de Clare, confined for supporting the wrong faction during a succession dispute, lived in chambers decorated with silk hangings and imported carpets. She embroidered, played musical instruments, and received regular visits from priests, friends, and family members. Her biggest complaint? Boredom, not brutality. Then there's the fascinating case of political prisoners who were essentially royal guests. When Scottish nobles were captured during wars with England, they often lived in English castles for years under house arrest. They hunted with their captors, played chess, shared meals, and formed genuine friendships. Some even married into their captors' families. War was business, not personal. The logistics of noble imprisonment created interesting problems. Who paid for all this luxury? Sometimes the prisoners' own estates funded their confinement, creating the bizarre situation where someone literally paid for their own imprisonment. Other times the crown covered expenses, viewing comfortable captivity as a political investment. A well-treated prisoner might eventually become a loyal ally. Guards assigned to noble prisoners held prestigious positions. Rather than dealing with violent criminals, they managed what amounted to exclusive social clubs. These guards often came from minor nobility themselves, understanding the social protocols required. They knew when to be present, when to disappear, and how to maintain the delicate balance between supervision and respect. Escape attempts by nobles were rare, but not because of tight security. Why flee comfortable quarters to become fugitives living rough in forests? Many noble prisoners genuinely preferred their current situation to the uncertain life of an outlaw. Plus, escape would be seen as breaking one's word of honor, a serious offense in medieval culture. Some nobles actually requested house arrest over other punishments. Facing potential execution or harsh fines, they might negotiate for comfortable confinement instead. This created the odd spectacle of people arguing for longer prison sentences in exchange for better conditions. A year in luxury beat a quick death any day. The most comfortable arrangements involved exchange prisoners, nobles held as guarantees for treaties or ransom payments. These weren't really criminals at all, just very expensive insurance policies. They lived as honored guests, knowing their stay was temporary, and their treatment reflected their family's ability to pay enormous ransoms. But even noble imprisonment had its darker sides. Some were confined for decades, watching their land seized and families destroyed. Others went mad from years of luxury with no purpose or real freedom. Golden cages were still cages, just prettier ones. The guards' constant presence meant zero privacy. Every conversation was overheard, every letter read, every visitor screened. Nobles might have soft beds and fine food, but they lived under total surveillance. Some found this psychological pressure harder to bear than physical discomfort might have been. House arrest for nobles reveals how medieval justice bent around social status. The same crime that sent a peasant to chains and starvation might land a lord in comfortable quarters with servants and entertainment. Justice wasn't blind, it was very aware of who had money and power. These privileged prisoners lived in a strange world between freedom and captivity, comfort and control. Yet even they weren't immune to medieval justice's harsher side, as public punishments awaited those whose crimes demanded more visible consequences. While prisoners suffered behind bars, some medieval punishments happened right out in the open where everyone could watch. Public humiliation was just as important as prison time when it came to medieval justice. Town squares buzzed with excitement whenever someone got locked in the pillory or stocks for the day. The pillory was basically a wooden frame with holes cut out for your head and hands. Once they locked you in, you couldn't move much at all. Your face stayed exposed to whatever the crowd wanted to throw at you. The stocks worked similarly but trapped your feet instead, forcing you to sit there helplessly while people gathered around to mock you. These contraptions weren't random torture devices, they served a very specific purpose in medieval society. Public shaming was supposed to deter other people from committing similar crimes. When your neighbors saw you getting pelted with rotten vegetables in the town square, they'd think twice before breaking the same laws you did. What crimes landed you in public punishment? Blasphemy was a big one. Curse God or the church in public, and you'd spend days with your head locked in a pillory while townspeople reminded you of your mistake. Cheating customers at the market was another favorite target for public humiliation. Bakers who sold underweight bread or brewers who watered down their ale often found themselves starring in the town square's daily entertainment. Then there were the moral crimes that really got people worked up: adultery, prostitution, or even gossiping too much about your neighbors could earn you a spot in the stocks. The community took these offenses personally because they threatened the social order everyone depended on. The crowds that gathered weren't just casual observers either. They came prepared for the show. Rotten eggs, spoiled fruit, and sometimes even human waste got hurled at the helpless prisoners. People brought their children to watch and learn what happened to rule breakers. It was like a twisted family outing that doubled as a moral lesson. But the weird part is how these public punishments created their own social dynamics. Some prisoners became local celebrities of sorts. If you were funny enough or charming enough, you might actually win over the crowd. They'd start throwing softer things or even bring you food and water instead of garbage. Weather played a huge role in how miserable these punishments became. Getting locked in stocks during summer wasn't too bad if people were feeling merciful. Winter was brutal though. Snow, rain, and freezing temperatures made every hour feel like torture. Some prisoners actually died from exposure during particularly harsh weather. The timing mattered too. Market days meant bigger crowds and more humiliation. Festivals brought out the most creative hecklers who'd spend all day thinking up new insults. Religious holidays sometimes offered mercy though. When good Christian folk felt obligated to show kindness to the suffering, women faced special challenges during public punishments. Besides the usual rotten food, they had to deal with more personal attacks on their appearance and virtue. Male prisoners might get called thieves or liars, but women endured much crueler commentary about their bodies and morality. Local officials controlled how severe these public shaming sessions became. Some towns appointed guards to prevent the crowd from getting too violent. Others basically let anything short of murder happen to the person in the pillory. The prisoner's social status influenced this too. Embarrassing a merchant's daughter brought different consequences than humiliating a beggar. What's really interesting is how these public punishments connected with the prison system. Many prisoners actually preferred a few days in the stocks over weeks locked in a dungeon cell. At least outside you got fresh air, sunlight, and human contact, even if that contact involved people throwing things at your face. The church played a complicated role in all this public shaming. Priests sometimes intervened to stop particularly cruel crowds, reminding everyone about Christian mercy. But the same religious authorities also designed many of these punishments specifically to teach moral lessons to the whole community. Night brought its own problems for people stuck in public restraints. Towns didn't provide guards after dark, so prisoners became easy targets for anyone with a grudge. Dogs wandered freely through most medieval towns, and they weren't always friendly to helpless humans trapped in wooden frames. Some clever prisoners figured out ways to make their public punishment more bearable. They'd arrange for friends to show up with good food or clean water. Others would put on performances telling jokes or singing songs to win sympathy from the crowd. A few even used their captive audience to settle old scores by shouting accusations at people who'd wronged them. These public spectacles revealed something important about medieval justice. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty person. The whole community participated in enforcing social rules through these shared rituals of humiliation and shame. Of course, not everyone who broke laws ended up in public stocks or private dungeon cells. Some medieval prisoners found themselves in very different circumstances, especially those who owed money rather than committed violent crimes. Being locked up for owing money sounds crazy today, but in medieval times, debt was serious business. Forget what you've seen in movies about debtors' prisons being gentle places where people sat around reading books and playing chess. The reality was messier, stranger, and sometimes surprisingly harsh. Debt could land you in jail faster than stealing a loaf of bread. Medieval society ran on credit systems that would make modern loan sharks jealous. A baker might owe the miller, who owed the lord, who owed the king. When someone couldn't pay, the whole chain collapsed. Authorities needed a way to squeeze money out of people, and prison seemed like the perfect pressure cooker. Here's where it gets weird though. Debtors weren't supposed to work while imprisoned. The logic was backwards. You owed money, so they locked you up where you couldn't earn any. Makes sense, right? Well, not really. The idea was that your friends, family, or business partners would scramble to pay your debts to get you out. Basically medieval crowdfunding with imprisonment as motivation. The conditions in debt prisons varied wildly depending on your social status and how much you owed. Rich merchants who defaulted on massive loans got relatively comfortable accommodations. They could afford to pay jailers for decent food, clean bedding, and private rooms. These guys lived better in prison than some free peasants lived at home. Poor debtors faced a completely different reality. Thrown into communal cells with actual criminals, they survived on charity or starved. Many debt prisoners relied entirely on donations from townspeople or church organizations. Without outside help, you'd waste away while your debt remained unpaid. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The poorer you were, the longer you stayed locked up for being poor. But here's what made debt prisons particularly twisted. Interest kept accumulating while you sat in jail. Your debt grew larger every day you remained imprisoned. Some prisoners discovered they owed more money after 6 months in jail than when they entered. Talk about adding insult to injury. Jailers treated debtors differently than other prisoners in some unexpected ways. Since debtors weren't considered dangerous criminals, they often received more freedom within the prison. They could socialize freely, receive visitors without heavy restrictions, and sometimes even leave temporarily on parole to attempt earning money. Of course, skipping town during these releases meant much worse punishment if caught. Women debtors faced additional complications. Married women couldn't legally own property or make contracts, so their husbands' debts automatically became their problem. Widows often inherited massive debts along with their grief. Some women ended up imprisoned for debts they never knew existed until their husbands died. The law didn't care about fairness. Debt was debt. Family dynamics around debt imprisonment created fascinating social dramas. Relatives had to decide whether supporting an imprisoned debtor was worth their own financial risk. Some families pooled resources to free their imprisoned member. Others cut ties completely, leaving the debtor to rot. These decisions split families permanently and reshaped entire social networks. Then there's the question of what counted as debt. Obviously, borrowed money qualified, but medieval definitions stretched much further. Unpaid taxes became imprisonment-worthy debt. Failed business partnerships led to jail time. Even unpaid dowries could result in prison sentences. Marriage contracts were essentially financial agreements, and breaking them had serious consequences. Churches played complicated roles in debt imprisonment. Christian teachings emphasized forgiveness and charity, but church institutions often acted as creditors themselves. Monasteries loaned money and demanded repayment just like secular lenders. Religious authorities sometimes intervened to free debt prisoners as acts of mercy, but they also supported the system that created the problem. Some clever debtors found loopholes in the system. Claiming benefit of clergy could sometimes reduce sentences or transfer prisoners to more lenient church prisons. Others deliberately committed minor crimes, figuring criminal prison sentences had definite end dates, unlike potentially endless debt imprisonment. Prison economics got especially weird when multiple debtors were housed together. They'd create internal credit systems, trading favors and goods while imprisoned for debt. Prisoners who couldn't pay their original creditors started owing money to fellow inmates. The whole situation became incredibly tangled. Local variations in debt law created strange situations where crossing town boundaries could dramatically change your fate. What counted as imprisonable debt in one jurisdiction might be ignored completely in the next. Smart debtors learned to stay in friendly territories, while creditors hired bounty hunters to drag them back. Release from debt prison required either full payment or creditor forgiveness. Some prisoners negotiated reduced settlements, paying fractions of original debts in exchange for freedom. Others relied on charitable organizations that specialized in freeing debt prisoners. A few simply waited for creditors to die, hoping debts would be forgotten or forgiven. While debt prisons might sound less violent than criminal jails, the psychological torture was arguably worse. At least criminals knew their sentences would eventually end. Debtors faced potentially infinite imprisonment, watching their situations worsen daily while unable to work towards solutions. But debt wasn't the only factor determining who ended up behind bars. Women faced unique challenges in medieval prisons that went far beyond financial troubles. Medieval prisons weren't exactly known for their progressive views on gender equality, but women still found themselves behind bars regularly. The difference? They got their own special treatment, and not always the kind you'd want. Most jails kept women completely separate from male prisoners. This wasn't about respect or dignity. Prison officials worried about what might happen when you mixed desperate men with vulnerable women in cramped, dark spaces. Makes sense, right? But this separation came with its own problems. Female prisoners often got stuck in the worst parts of the building, damp basement cells or tiny rooms with no windows. Finding female guards was nearly impossible. Most jailers were men, which created awkward and dangerous situations. When a woman needed to be searched, moved or disciplined, male guards handled everything. Some prisons occasionally hired older women to supervise female inmates, but these jobs paid poorly and attracted few applicants. The women who did take these positions were often just as corrupt as their male counterparts, demanding bribes for basic necessities like clean straw or extra food. Female prisoners faced the same class divisions as men but with extra complications. Wealthy women could still buy better accommodations and food, they might rent a private cell or even bring a servant to jail with them. Poor women, however, got absolutely nothing. They relied entirely on charity from local churches or kind-hearted townspeople. Without family money or connections, these women often starved. Then there was the pregnancy issue. Medieval jails had no idea how to handle pregnant inmates. Most prisons lacked any medical knowledge about childbirth or infant care. Women gave birth on dirty straw floors with no help except from fellow prisoners. If the baby survived, and many didn't, it usually stayed in jail with the mother. Some lucky infants got sent to relatives outside, but others grew up behind bars. Pregnant women sometimes used their condition to delay harsh punishments. Courts occasionally postponed executions or severe penalties until after childbirth, but this mercy had limits. Once the baby was born, the original sentence resumed. Nursing mothers might get a few extra months, but eventually faced whatever punishment awaited them. Female criminals faced charges similar to men: theft, debt, assault, and adultery. But women also dealt with uniquely female crimes: prostitution, witchcraft accusations, and scold charges. Basically, being too mouthy or argumentative filled women's jail cells. Society expected women to be quiet, obedient, and pure. Step outside these boundaries, and you might find yourself chained to a prison wall. The weird part is that some women actually ran illegal businesses from inside jail. Female prisoners smuggled goods, passed messages, and even arranged meetings between male inmates and outside visitors. Guards often looked the other way if they got their cut of the profits. Women proved surprisingly resourceful at turning their separate quarters into miniature criminal enterprises. Children complicated everything further. Many jails allowed mothers to keep young children with them, but this created new problems. Kids needed food, got sick frequently, and made noise. Other prisoners sometimes helped care for the children, creating unexpected prison families. But watching children grow up in such horrible conditions broke even hardened criminals' hearts. Religious women got special treatment in some regions. Nuns accused of breaking church rules might end up in monastery prisons instead of public jails. These religious institutions were usually cleaner and safer than regular dungeons, though they came with their own forms of punishment: endless prayers, fasting, and isolation. Female prisoners often knew each other before arriving in jail. Small medieval communities meant that the prostitute, the debtor's wife, and the accused witch might be neighbors on the outside. This familiarity sometimes created support networks inside prison walls. Women shared food, told stories, and helped each other survive the miserable conditions. Some women entered prison pregnant with their jailer's child. Sexual abuse by guards was common and rarely punished. These unwanted pregnancies created legal nightmares: who was responsible for the child? Could the mother claim the jailer as father? Most courts ignored these situations entirely, leaving women to handle the consequences alone. Visiting rules varied wildly for female prisoners. Some jails allowed female relatives to come and go freely, turning women's quarters into social gathering spaces. Other prisons restricted all contact with the outside world. The inconsistency depended largely on local customs and individual jailer preferences. But here's what nobody expected. Women's prison wards sometimes became centers of local gossip and news. Visitors brought stories from around town, and female prisoners became surprisingly well informed about community affairs. They knew who was sleeping with whom, which merchants were cheating customers, and what political schemes were brewing. Women's experiences behind bars reflected the harsh realities of medieval society, where gender determined your fate just as much as your crime. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, female prisoners found ways to survive, support each other, and sometimes even thrive. However, not all medieval prisoners faced the standard castle dungeon experience. Some criminals found themselves in completely different surroundings. Medieval forests weren't just peaceful places where people picked berries and collected firewood. They were legal minefields controlled by kings and nobles who treated every tree, deer, and rabbit like personal property. Break the wrong twig or catch the wrong fish, and you'd find yourself in a forest prison facing punishments that made regular jail look like a holiday. Forest laws existed in a world completely separate from city rules. While town criminals might steal bread or dodge debts, forest criminals committed crimes most people today wouldn't even recognize as illegal: hunting a rabbit on royal land. Prison: cutting down a tree without permission. Prison: letting your pig eat acorns that belonged to the king. You guessed it, prison time. The punishments weren't just harsh, they were medieval harsh. Poachers caught hunting deer faced losing their hands, feet, or eyes. Some faced castration if they were repeat offenders. These weren't empty threats either. Forest courts had a reputation for following through on their promises, and judges showed little mercy for anyone who dared touch the king's animals. But here's where it gets interesting. Forest prisons operated differently than regular jails. Instead of cramming criminals into castle dungeons, forest authorities often built special holding areas right in the woods. Some were crude wooden structures barely better than animal pens. Others were stone buildings hidden deep in the forest where screams wouldn't reach nearby villagers. Forest prisoners faced a unique kind of isolation. Regular jail inmates could at least hope for visits from family or charity from townspeople. Forest criminals were locked away where few people even traveled. The silence must have been deafening after months of hearing nothing but wind through trees and the occasional howl of wild animals. The guards who ran these remote prisons held incredible power with almost no oversight. They could abuse prisoners without anyone knowing or caring. Some forest guards became petty tyrants who enjoyed their control over people who had nowhere to run and no one to appeal to for help. What crimes actually landed people in forest prisons? The list was longer than you might expect. Taking honey from wild beehives was theft of royal property. Fishing in certain streams meant stealing the king's fish. Even gathering fallen branches could be illegal if you did it in the wrong place or without permission. Forest laws covered everything from hunting rights to tree ownership, and breaking any of them could ruin your life. The wealthy rarely ended up in forest prisons because they could afford hunting licenses and legal permissions. Poor people, however, often had no choice but to poach or gather illegally just to survive harsh winters. A peasant family facing starvation might risk everything to catch one rabbit, knowing full well that getting caught meant imprisonment or worse. Forest courts moved differently than regular courts too. While city judges dealt with dozens of cases involving theft, debt, and disputes, forest judges specialized in environmental crimes that required specific knowledge about hunting seasons, territorial boundaries, and wildlife laws. These judges often knew the forests better than the criminals they sentenced. Then there's the matter of evidence. Proving someone stole a loaf of bread in town was straightforward, either you had the bread or you didn't. Proving someone illegally hunted in the forest required tracking skills, witness testimony, and detailed knowledge about animal populations and hunting rights. Forest trials could turn into complex investigations that dragged on for weeks. Some forest prisoners became long-term residents, not by choice but by circumstance. A poacher who lost his hands couldn't easily return to normal work, so he might remain in forest custody indefinitely. Others became informants, helping guards catch new criminals in exchange for better treatment or early release. The psychological impact of forest imprisonment was brutal in its own way. City prisoners could hear life continuing outside their walls, merchants selling goods, children playing, church bells ringing. Forest prisoners heard only wilderness sounds that reminded them daily of the very environment that had gotten them in trouble. Forest laws also created a strange economy of permits and bribes. Wealthy landowners could buy hunting rights that poor people could never afford. Guards could be paid to look the other way when someone collected firewood illegally. The whole system encouraged corruption while claiming to protect royal forests. But wait until you hear about the surprising way medieval communities found to help these forgotten prisoners. The story of charity and donations reveals just how differently medieval people viewed justice and mercy, especially when it came to helping those society had essentially thrown away. Life in medieval prisons wasn't just about surviving guards, rats, and terrible food. Poor prisoners faced another massive challenge: starving to death while waiting for justice. The pay-to-stay system meant wealthy inmates bought their meals, comfortable beds, and even wine. But what happened to prisoners with empty pockets? They relied on something that kept many medieval prisons from becoming death traps: community charity. Medieval towns took feeding poor prisoners seriously, not because they were particularly kind-hearted, but because letting people starve in jail reflected badly on the entire community. Dead prisoners meant failed justice, and nobody wanted that reputation. Local churches organized regular food donations. Wealthy merchants contributed money for bread and soup. Even ordinary townspeople pitched in with leftover food, old blankets, or worn clothing. The system worked like this: charitable organizations, usually connected to churches, collected donations specifically for prisoners. They'd arrive at jails with baskets of bread, jugs of ale, and sometimes meat or cheese. These donations went straight to the beggar's ward, where inmates with no money waited for trial or served their sentences. Without this charity, many would have simply wasted away. But here's where things got interesting. Jailers were supposed to distribute charity fairly among poor prisoners. In reality, many pocketed the best donations for themselves. Fresh bread became stale crusts by the time prisoners saw it. Good ale turned into watered-down leftovers. Some jailers sold charitable donations in local markets, then bought cheaper food for inmates while keeping the profit. Church-organized charity worked differently than random acts of kindness. Religious groups followed schedules for prison visits. They'd show up every Sunday with predetermined amounts of food and supplies. Monks from local monasteries often handled these duties, seeing prison charity as part of their religious obligations. They kept records of what they gave, and sometimes checked on individual prisoners week after week. The wealthy played their part too, though with mixed motives. Rich merchants and nobles donated to prison charities, partly from genuine concern, but mostly for social status. Being known as someone who fed prisoners earned respect in medieval communities. These donors often specified exactly how their money should be spent, for bread only, or for blankets in winter. Some even visited prisons personally to oversee distribution of their donations. Women's charitable groups proved especially active in prison work. Wealthy wives organized collection drives, gathering food, clothing, and blankets from their social circles. They understood that female prisoners faced unique challenges and often directed donations specifically toward women's wards. These groups sometimes provided items male organizers overlooked: soap, combs, or fabric for basic clothing repairs. Seasonal charity patterns emerged across medieval Europe. Winter donations increased dramatically as communities recognized that unheated prison cells could become death traps. Christmas and Easter brought special food collections. Harvest time meant surplus grain found its way to prison kitchens. During famines, though, prison charity dried up quickly as communities struggled to feed themselves. The types of donations revealed what medieval people considered essential for survival. Bread dominated charitable giving, followed by small beer or watered wine. Cheese, when available, provided crucial protein. Old clothing kept prisoners from freezing. Straw for bedding appeared regularly in donation records. Occasionally, someone donated candles, bringing precious light to dark cells. Some charitable systems got creative with fundraising. Towns organized special markets where a portion of sales went to prison funds. Churches collected extra donations during certain sermons. Guilds of craftsmen or merchants sometimes adopted specific prisons, providing regular support throughout the year. These organized efforts proved more reliable than random individual generosity. Religious holidays transformed prison charity into community events. On major feast days, charitable groups would arrive with special meals for prisoners: meat instead of bread, fresh ale, even sweet treats. These occasions reminded both prisoners and townspeople that incarcerated individuals remained part of the community, deserving of basic human dignity, despite their crimes. The impact of charity varied wildly between regions and time periods. Well-organized communities with active churches kept their poor prisoners adequately fed. Towns with weak charitable systems saw higher death rates in jails. Political upheavals disrupted donation patterns, leaving prisoners vulnerable during conflicts or economic downturns. Records from various medieval prisons show charity sometimes exceeded basic needs. Generous donations occasionally provided poor prisoners with better food than they'd eaten while free. This created an odd situation where some beggars or unemployed people viewed short prison sentences as opportunities for regular meals and shelter. But charity came with strings attached. Recipients were expected to show gratitude and often required to pray for their benefactors. Some charitable organizations demanded prisoners attend religious services or confession sessions in exchange for food. Refusing these conditions meant going hungry, creating another form of control within prison walls. The medieval charity system reveals something fascinating about prison life. It wasn't completely isolated from outside society. While wealthy prisoners bought their independence, poor inmates remained connected to their communities through these charitable networks. This connection would prove crucial when prisoners needed something even more valuable than food. Medieval prisoners weren't completely cut off from the outside world like you might expect. Actually, the flow of information into prisons was surprisingly steady. Visitors didn't just bring food or comfort items, they carried the most valuable currency of all: news from town. Think about it. No internet, no television, no newspapers delivered to your cell. But that doesn't mean inmates lived in total ignorance. Guards chatted with prisoners about local happenings. Fellow inmates shared rumors they'd heard before getting locked up. And visitors, they were walking news broadcasts. A merchant's wife visiting her debtor husband might mention that the king's tax collectors had arrived in town. A priest conducting confession could slip details about political tensions brewing between nobles. Even the poorest prisoners received scraps of gossip from charity workers who distributed food. Information traveled through prison walls almost as easily as it moved through medieval streets. Political prisoners followed current events with particular intensity. These weren't common criminals worried about their next meal. They were nobles, clerks, or rebels whose freedom often depended on shifting political winds. When Lord so-and-so fell out of favor with the king, his supporters in prison knew their chances of release had just dropped dramatically. But if that same lord regained royal approval, suddenly hope flickered back to life. Messages sometimes arrived through surprisingly clever channels. A baker delivering bread might whisper urgent news to a specific prisoner. Family members developed coded conversations that guards couldn't decipher. Religious visitors proved especially useful for passing along sensitive information, since their conversations with inmates were considered private spiritual matters. The weird part is how quickly gossip spread once it entered prison walls. Inmates had nothing but time to discuss, analyze, and embellish every piece of news they received. A simple report about a merchant dispute could transform into an elaborate tale of corruption involving half the town council. Prisoners became expert interpreters of local politics, passing every rumor for clues about their own fate. Some jails received actual written materials, though this was relatively rare. Wealthy prisoners occasionally obtained books or letters through bribery. Religious texts were more common, but even these carried news in their margins or between the lines. A seemingly innocent prayer book might contain coded updates about family business or political developments. Then there's the matter of different prisoner social circles. Debtors cared most about economic news, which trades were thriving, which merchants had failed, what new taxes might affect their creditors. Criminal inmates wanted to know about law enforcement activities and recent arrests. Political prisoners obsessed over court intrigue and noble feuds. Each group filtered incoming information through their particular concerns. Guards played a crucial role in this information network, whether they realized it or not. Many jailers lived in the same communities as their prisoners' families. They shopped in the same markets, attended the same churches, heard the same rumors. Even the most professional guard might casually mention that someone's neighbor had been seen talking to the sheriff. Prisoners hung on every careless word. But here's what made medieval prison gossip particularly intense. The stakes were often life or death. A rumor about the king's mood could mean the difference between execution and pardon for political prisoners. News about a creditor's financial situation might determine whether a debtor would rot in jail or gain freedom. Every piece of information carried weight that modern prisoners rarely experience. Letters were precious commodities when they did appear. Literate prisoners often read aloud to their cellmates, sharing not just personal news but broader updates about regional conflicts, trade disruptions, or religious changes. A single letter might provide entertainment and information for an entire ward of inmates. The flow of information wasn't one way either. Prisoners sent messages out through the same channels that brought news in. They passed along requests for help, instructions about family business, or warnings about dangers they'd learned about from other inmates. Medieval prisons functioned as informal communication hubs for their communities. Religious festivals and holy days brought especially rich information exchanges. Clergy members visited more frequently during these periods. Charity increased, and families made special efforts to see imprisoned relatives. Prisoners could count on these occasions for fresh updates about everything happening beyond their walls. What's fascinating is how this constant information flow affected prison social dynamics. Inmates who received regular news became more valuable to their fellow prisoners. Those with connections to important visitors gained status within jail hierarchies. Knowledge truly was power, even behind bars. The quality of information varied wildly, of course. Some news arrived accurate and timely. Other reports were weeks old, thoroughly distorted, or completely fabricated. Prisoners developed their own systems for evaluating reliability, trusting certain sources while dismissing others as unreliable gossips. This steady stream of outside news helped medieval prisoners maintain connections to their communities in ways that might surprise modern observers. While their treatment certainly varied based on wealth and status, this flow of information hints at just how different freedom and captivity really were during this period. Prison walls weren't always the final destination for medieval criminals. Walking out of a dungeon didn't necessarily mean walking free. Many inmates discovered their real punishment was just beginning. The medieval justice system loved its dramatic flair. Public punishments drew crowds like modern sporting events. Town squares filled with eager spectators whenever authorities decided to make an example of someone. These weren't just entertainment. They were carefully orchestrated warnings to anyone considering similar crimes. Branding was surprisingly common for released prisoners. Hot iron pressed against skin created permanent reminders of wrongdoing. Thieves often received marks on their hands or foreheads. The letter T for thief became a lifetime advertisement of past crimes. Finding work afterward, nearly impossible. The brand followed them everywhere, making normal life extremely difficult. Then there were the creative punishments that make modern penalties look gentle. Poachers caught hunting in royal forests faced mutilation as standard practice. Losing a finger, hand, or even an eye wasn't unusual. Forest laws were particularly brutal because they protected the king's hunting grounds. Nobles took their deer very seriously. Exile represented another harsh reality for many former prisoners. Banishment from your hometown meant losing everything: family, friends, livelihood, protection. Medieval people rarely traveled far from home. Being cast out was essentially a death sentence, just slower and more miserable. Some towns branded exiles before sending them away, ensuring they couldn't easily blend into new communities. Public stocks and pillories waited for prisoners guilty of minor offenses or those serving additional punishment time. These devices were designed for maximum humiliation. Crowds gathered to mock, throw rotten vegetables, or worse, at helpless victims. Hours or days locked in uncomfortable positions while townspeople expressed their displeasure was psychologically devastating. The weird part is how flexible these punishments could be. Wealthy criminals often negotiated their way out of harsh penalties. A fat purse could transform a branding into a fine, or exile into house arrest. Poor prisoners faced the full force of medieval justice while rich ones found creative alternatives. Repeat offenders discovered the system had little patience for second chances. Third-time thieves often faced execution, regardless of what they stole. Stealing bread could lead to the gallows if you'd been caught before. Medieval authorities believed escalating punishments would deter crime. Whether this actually worked is debatable, but it certainly kept executioners busy. Religious crimes carried their own special punishments beyond prison time. Heretics might face public penance, forced to wear distinctive clothing or carry symbols of their shame. Some had to make pilgrimages to distant shrines as part of their punishment. Others found themselves doing unpaid labor for churches or monasteries. Women faced gender-specific punishments that reflected medieval attitudes about female behavior. Gossiping or nagging could result in wearing a scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over the head with a piece that pressed down the tongue. Public humiliation for women often focused on perceived moral failings rather than just criminal behavior. Debt prisoners experienced unique post-release challenges. Even after leaving jail, their debts remained. Creditors could demand immediate payment or throw them back in prison. Some debtors spent years cycling between freedom and imprisonment, never managing to clear their obligations completely. Political prisoners faced the most uncertain futures after release. Their freedom often depended on changing political winds. A former ally's fall from grace could mean their own return to prison. Some chose exile over remaining in hostile territory, knowing their liberty remained precarious. Public executions represented the ultimate punishment beyond prison walls. These spectacles drew massive crowds and served multiple purposes. They eliminated criminals permanently while providing entertainment and moral instruction for spectators. Methods varied by region and crime, but the message was always clear. The concept of rehabilitation barely existed in medieval thinking. Punishment focused on retribution, deterrence, and public satisfaction rather than reforming criminals. Society expected punishment to hurt, both physically and socially. The idea that prison might actually prepare someone for productive citizenship was centuries away. Documentation from various medieval towns reveals how these extended punishments shaped communities. Released prisoners often formed their own social groups, supporting each other when respectable society rejected them. Some turned to organized crime, finding legitimate opportunities closed to them. Interestingly, some criminals preferred staying in prison to facing what awaited outside. At least jail provided food, shelter, and protection from vengeful victims or their families. The outside world offered no such guarantees for marked criminals. Church sanctuary offered one possible escape from post-prison punishments. Criminals who reached consecrated ground could claim protection, though this usually meant permanent exile rather than true freedom. Many churches reluctantly provided this service, knowing it protected their sacred authority. But medieval justice wasn't finished with criminals even after all these punishments. The system had developed ways to track repeat offenders and ensure their past followed them permanently. Understanding how this surveillance worked reveals just how sophisticated medieval law enforcement could be when authorities really wanted to control someone's future. Being locked away from the world does terrible things to your mind. Medieval prisoners didn't just face physical hardships like chains and terrible food. Their mental health crumbled in ways that would horrify us today. Isolation hit hardest. Many prisoners spent months or years seeing only their jailers and maybe a few cellmates. No family visits for weeks. No friendly conversations, just stone walls and darkness. The human brain wasn't built for this kind of loneliness, and medieval people knew it. They called it melancholy, or madness, but they had no real understanding of what we'd now call depression or anxiety disorders. Sunlight became a luxury most prisoners rarely enjoyed. Those locked in basement cells or windowless chambers went months without seeing daylight. Makes sense, right? Their bodies stopped producing the chemicals needed for good moods. Many prisoners described feeling heavy or dark inside. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others talked constantly to themselves or invisible companions. The weird part is how quickly mental breakdown could happen. Strong knights who'd faced battle without flinching would become babbling messes after just a few weeks in solitary confinement. Women who'd managed entire households suddenly couldn't remember their own names. Prison records mention inmates who lost their wits or became simple in the head. Religious penance made things worse for many prisoners. Priests visited regularly, demanding confessions and forcing inmates to pray for hours. But instead of bringing comfort, this constant focus on sin and punishment drove some prisoners deeper into despair. They began believing they were damned forever. Some refused to eat, thinking starvation would cleanse their souls. Others became convinced that demons lived in their cells. Then there's the problem of no medical help. Medieval people had no trained doctors for mental illness. They thought madness came from evil spirits or God's punishment. Treatment involved more prayer, bloodletting, or sometimes beating the demons out of prisoners. These cures usually made mental health problems much worse. Fellow inmates provided the only real support available. Prisoners looked out for each other in surprising ways. When someone started losing their grip on reality, cellmates would share food, tell stories, or simply sit nearby during bad episodes. These small acts of kindness sometimes kept people from completely breaking down. Sleep became another enemy. Prisoners lay awake on hard floors, listening to rats scurrying and other inmates crying or talking in their sleep. Nightmares plagued those who did manage to rest. Many developed what we'd recognize as insomnia. They'd pace their cells all night, muttering prayers or curses. Guards learned to ignore these nighttime disturbances. Memory problems affected long-term prisoners too. Some forgot their families' faces or their own children's names. Others became obsessed with the past, telling the same stories over and over about life before prison. A few prisoners convinced themselves they were someone else entirely, claiming to be kings or saints instead of accepting their real identities. Physical symptoms of mental distress showed up regularly. Prisoners developed mysterious aches and pains with no obvious cause. Some pulled out their own hair or scratched at their skin until it bled. Others stopped caring about basic cleanliness, even when water was available. These behaviors puzzled medieval jailers who expected prisoners to maintain some dignity. Let's not forget the prisoners who found strange ways to cope. Some created elaborate fantasy worlds in their minds, spending hours traveling to imaginary places. Others developed obsessive rituals, counting stones in their cell walls, or arranging their meager possessions in exact patterns dozens of times per day. These habits helped them feel some control over their helpless situations. Wealthy prisoners with better accommodations still suffered mental health problems, though perhaps less severely. Having books, writing materials, or comfortable beds didn't prevent the deep sadness that came from losing freedom. Even nobles under house arrest described feeling heavy-hearted or sick with grief after months of confinement. Some prisoners actually got better mentally as time passed. They adapted to prison routines and found peace in the simple, predictable life behind bars. These inmates often became leaders among their fellow prisoners, offering advice and keeping order in chaotic situations. But this acceptance took years to develop, and many prisoners never reached this point. The most tragic cases involved prisoners who'd been mentally healthy before arrest, but left prison permanently damaged. Families didn't recognize relatives who returned home after long sentences. Former inmates struggled to rejoin society, jumping at loud noises or refusing to enter small rooms. Medieval communities had no support systems for these damaged individuals. Religious authorities occasionally recognized that some prisoners needed spiritual healing rather than punishment. A few monasteries accepted former inmates who'd lost their minds, providing care and shelter, but these arrangements were rare and usually temporary. What happened to prisoners after they served their time often depended on how well their minds had survived the experience. But that's a story about freedom and its own complicated challenges. Getting out of medieval prison wasn't like checking out of a hotel. No paperwork to sign, no belongings to collect from a front desk. Most prisoners didn't even know their exact release date until someone unlocked their chains and pointed toward the door. The lucky ones walked free because they'd served their time, but serving time worked differently back then. A sentence for theft might say until the next harvest, or when the moon completes 3 cycles. Vague, absolutely. Fair, that depended entirely on who was counting the days. Money talked louder than justice, as usual. Wealthy prisoners could buy their way out early by paying hefty fines or bribing the right officials. A merchant jailed for cheating customers might spend weeks negotiating with local authorities, offering gold in exchange for shortened sentences. The poor, they served every single day, plus whatever extra time guards felt like adding. Then there were the mysterious disappearances. Some prisoners simply vanished from their cells without explanation. Guards would claim ignorance, shrugging when asked about missing inmates. Had they escaped, been secretly executed, died of illness and been quietly buried? Nobody kept detailed records, so these vanishing acts remained unsolved puzzles. Religious holidays offered another path to freedom. Christmas, Easter, and local saint days brought waves of pardons from generous nobles wanting to show their piety. Prisoners would pray desperately as these holidays approached, hoping their names would appear on mercy lists. Some did. Others watched fellow inmates walk free while they remained chained to the walls. Good behavior meant something, though the definition varied wildly between prisons. Helping with kitchen work, informing on troublesome cellmates, or simply keeping quiet might earn early release. But guards held all the power to decide what counted as good. One jailer might appreciate a prisoner's helpful attitude, while another saw the same behavior as suspicious. Political prisoners faced the most unpredictable releases. Wars ended, alliances shifted, and enemy nobles suddenly became useful allies. A prisoner rotting in chains for supporting the wrong lord might find themselves freed and rewarded when political winds changed direction. These dramatic reversals happened overnight, leaving other inmates bewildered by the sudden departure of long-term cellmates. Public ceremonies sometimes marked important releases, especially for high-profile prisoners. Town crowds would gather to watch nobles emerge from castle dungeons, blinking in sunlight they hadn't seen for months or years. These spectacles served as propaganda, showing that justice had been served and mercy granted. The released prisoners, however, often looked more confused than grateful. Medical emergencies created unexpected exits too. Plague outbreaks forced authorities to empty entire prison wards quickly, releasing inmates to prevent disease from spreading further. Some prisoners who'd expected years behind bars found themselves walking free simply because keeping them posed health risks to the community. But freedom came with strings attached. Released prisoners might face exile from their hometowns, forbidden from returning for years or decades. Others received physical marks, brands on their foreheads or hands, that permanently identified them as former criminals. These scars followed them everywhere, making normal life nearly impossible. The weirdest releases involved trial by combat or ordeal. Some prisoners earned freedom by agreeing to fight in judicial duels, risking death for a chance at liberty. Others underwent ordeals by fire or water, with survival interpreted as divine proof of innocence. Win or survive, and the prison doors opened. Lose, and the problem solved itself permanently. Family connections worked magic for prisoner releases. A daughter marrying into a powerful family might secure her father's freedom as part of wedding negotiations. Sons joining military campaigns could earn pardons for imprisoned parents. These family-based releases had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with social climbing. Debt prisoners faced the simplest but often impossible requirement for freedom: paying what they owed. Some rotted in cells for years because their debts kept growing with interest and prison fees. Others saw relatives sell everything to buy their release, emerging free but financially ruined. The most fortunate prisoners earned releases through changed circumstances. Laws shifted, crimes were reclassified, or new rulers decided previous punishments were too harsh. These lucky individuals walked out not because they'd served their time, but because their crimes no longer existed on the books. Guards sometimes facilitated unofficial releases, accepting bribes to accidentally leave doors unlocked or look the other way during prisoner transfers. These quasi-escapes provided plausible deniability while generating income for corrupt officials. Release didn't guarantee safety though. Former prisoners often faced hostile communities unwilling to forget their crimes. Some discovered their property had been seized, their spouses remarried, or their businesses destroyed. Freedom meant starting over from absolutely nothing. Walking out of medieval prison was just the beginning of a new struggle. But what happened to the prison system itself as centuries passed? The whole medieval approach to justice was about to face some major changes. Medieval prisons weren't frozen in time like dusty museum pieces. They evolved, adapted and changed with the centuries. What worked in 1200 didn't necessarily make sense by 1400. The shifts weren't dramatic overnight revolutions, but slow transformations that reshaped prison life across Europe. Early medieval jails mostly housed debtors and people waiting for trial. Makes sense, right? Prison wasn't seen as punishment itself, it was just a holding pen. But by the 14th century something interesting happened. More actual criminals started filling the cells. Thieves, murderers and repeat offenders found themselves locked up for longer stretches. The prison population was changing, and jailers had to figure out how to handle this new reality. Cities were growing too. London, Paris and other major centers needed more jail space. Old castle dungeons couldn't handle the volume anymore. New buildings went up specifically designed as prisons. These weren't just converted castle towers or repurposed church basements. Architects actually thought about how to build better jails. Stronger walls, better ventilation, separate areas for different types of prisoners. Then there's the matter of organization. Early medieval prisons threw everyone together in chaotic heaps. Rich, poor, men, women, debtors, murderers, all crammed into whatever space was available. But slowly, authorities started separating people more systematically. Women got their own wards in more places. Debtors were kept apart from violent criminals. The wealthy still bought better accommodations, but the basic structure became more organized. Rules shifted too. What counted as a crime in 1100 might be perfectly legal by 1300. Forest laws relaxed in some regions while tightening in others. Church courts lost some power over secular crimes. Local lords couldn't just throw people in jail on a whim quite as easily. Legal procedures became more standardized, which meant prison stays became more predictable. Well, let's not forget the jailers themselves changed. Professional guards started replacing whoever happened to be available. Some regions developed actual training for prison staff. Corruption didn't disappear. Bribes and extortion remained common, but oversight improved in many places. Prisoners had slightly more recourse when guards went too far. Prison architecture got more sophisticated too. Instead of single large rooms packed with inmates, newer jails featured individual cells or smaller shared spaces. This wasn't about prisoner comfort. Authorities realized that separation made control easier. Riots were harder to organize when people couldn't gather in huge groups. Disease spread less quickly in smaller spaces, and the weird part is how punishment itself evolved. Early medieval justice focused heavily on public shaming and physical punishment. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts dominated town squares, but gradually, imprisonment itself became recognized as punishment. The idea that losing freedom was penalty enough started taking hold. This shift happened slowly and unevenly, but it marked a fundamental change in thinking. Economic factors played a role too. Running prisons cost money, and authorities looked for ways to make them profitable. Prisoner labor became more organized and systematic. Instead of random cleaning tasks, some jails developed actual workshops. Inmates produced goods that could be sold, helping offset the costs of housing them. Regional differences remained stark though. A prison in wealthy Venice looked nothing like a jail in rural Scotland. Local customs, laws, and resources shaped conditions dramatically. But trade routes and communication networks meant that innovation spread faster than before. A successful prison reform in one city might inspire changes elsewhere. Social attitudes were shifting as well. The church's influence on justice remained strong, but secular authorities gained more control over criminal matters. Religious penance still mattered, but practical concerns about public safety became more prominent. This tension created interesting hybrid approaches to punishment and rehabilitation. Technology crept in slowly, better locks, stronger chains, improved construction techniques all made prisons more secure. Escape became harder as builders learned from past breakouts. Record keeping improved too, making it harder for prisoners to simply disappear, or for corrupt officials to hide their activities. But here's what didn't change much. Life inside remained brutal for most inmates. Better organization and newer buildings didn't automatically mean better treatment. Poor prisoners still went hungry, disease still spread, and guards still abused their power. The fundamental hardships of medieval prison life persisted even as the system evolved around them. Food distribution became slightly more systematic in some places, but malnutrition remained common. Medical care improved marginally, but most prisoners still suffered without proper treatment. The pay-to-stay system continued dominating prison life, ensuring that wealth determined comfort levels. By the late medieval period, prisons had become permanent fixtures of urban life rather than emergency measures. They were institutions with their own cultures, hierarchies, and unwritten rules. This institutional development set the stage for even more dramatic changes that would come later, as medieval justice systems gradually transformed into something more recognizable to modern eyes. Medieval prisons left fingerprints all over modern society, though most people never realize it. Walk into any courthouse today, and you'll see the same basic ideas that medieval jailers used centuries ago. Bail money, medieval invention. Separating prisoners by wealth and status. They perfected that system long before anyone thought about reform. But here's where things get interesting. Those dramatic dungeon scenes in movies with prisoners chained to walls in pitch-black cells. Pure Hollywood nonsense for the most part. Real medieval prisoners often lived in conditions that would surprise modern audiences. They socialized with townspeople, received visitors regularly, and sometimes even left temporarily for festivals or family events. The castle dungeons that survive today as tourist attractions tell only part of the story. Most medieval prisoners never saw the inside of those stone chambers. They were locked up in converted rooms above city gates, in wooden structures attached to town halls, or in makeshift cells inside manor houses. The Tower of London gets all the attention, but thousands of smaller jails across Europe handled the daily business of medieval justice. Then there's the curious matter of who actually ended up behind bars. Forget the image of hardened criminals plotting their next heist. Medieval prisons were packed with people we'd barely consider lawbreakers today. Debtors who couldn't pay their bills, servants who talked back to their masters, people who worked on Sundays or ate meat during Lent. What's really wild is how money controlled everything, just like today. Wealthy prisoners bought comfortable beds, hired personal servants, and enjoyed better food than many free citizens. Poor inmates slept on straw and hoped for charity donations to avoid starvation. The system wasn't designed to be fair, it was designed to make jailers rich. Medieval handcuffs and restraints were surprisingly sophisticated, though they looked nothing like modern versions. Iron shackles were custom forged for individual prisoners. Wooden stocks came in different sizes and styles. Some restraints allowed limited movement, while others kept inmates completely immobilized. The craftsmanship was often impressive, which makes sense when you realize blacksmiths took pride in their work regardless of the product. But the real legacy lies in something more subtle. Medieval prisons established the idea that criminals should be separated from society rather than simply punished and released. Before this period, most justice was immediate: a fine, a public beating, or execution. The concept of holding people for months or years while they paid their debt to society was revolutionary. Community involvement was huge back then. Townspeople regularly visited prisoners, brought food and supplies, and stayed informed about who was locked up and why. Modern prisons are hidden away from public view, but medieval jails were integrated into daily life. Everyone knew what was happening inside, because everyone participated in the system somehow. The religious element shaped everything too. Priests visited regularly, not just to offer comfort, but to extract confessions and guide spiritual punishment. Some prisoners spent more time praying than sitting idle. This connection between physical punishment and spiritual redemption influenced prison systems for centuries afterward. Women's experiences in medieval prisons varied dramatically based on social class, but the basic principle of separating male and female inmates started during this period. Female guards were rare, but when they existed, they often wielded significant power within their domains. Pregnancy complicated everything, and most jails had informal arrangements for handling children born in custody. The myths about medieval prisons being universally brutal torture chambers persist because they make good stories. Reality was more complex, and often more interesting. Yes, torture happened, but it was typically reserved for serious crimes and confession extraction. Most prisoners faced boredom, discomfort, and social humiliation rather than daily physical abuse. Forest prisons remain one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval justice. These specialized facilities handled environmental crimes centuries before anyone coined the term conservation. Poaching a royal deer could cost you more than robbing a merchant, which tells you something about medieval priorities. Modern prison architecture still follows medieval patterns in surprising ways. Cell blocks, guard towers, and secure entrances all trace back to castle designs. Even the basic concept of doing time comes from medieval practices of holding people until they could pay fines or complete penance requirements. The paperwork was minimal but effective. Medieval jailers kept records that modern administrators would recognize: who arrived when, what they owed, who visited them. Some of these documents survive today and provide incredible insights into daily prison life. Looking back, medieval prisons were neither the romantic adventures portrayed in some stories, nor the hellish nightmares depicted in others. They were practical institutions that reflected the values, limitations, and innovations of their time. Understanding how they really worked helps us see our own justice system with fresh eyes and maybe question some assumptions we take for granted.